Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 6, our final 6 of PPA 535 Intergovernmental Relations. It's good seeing you again. Again, this is our final week, and so for our topic for tonight will be the current and future issues for intergovernmental relations. And so originally we had 7 articles for discussion tonight. Due to illness, we only have 6 of them available tonight. So since we only have 6 articles to discuss, I would think that we'll probably be able to get through all those articles pretty easily tonight. And then hopefully that will mean we will not have to have a Saturday session on the 27th. So let me just go over our agenda for this evening. I don't think Allegra is in yet, but we're going to go back and pick up on the Entrepreneurial Cities article, the Spraja article, which is Allegra's. Then we have the Federalism by Waiver article, which belongs to Rosa. Then we have the Tax Cuts and Job Acts article, which is Marissa's. Then we have Voting Reform article, which is Asael's. And then we have Governors in Control, which is Adolfo's. And then Fiscal Federalism and Economic Crisis, which belongs to John. So those are our 6 articles that we will be discussing this evening. Then we are done with those articles. Then I will wrap everything up and talk to you a bit about the state of American federalism and those 2 articles from Publius that I will lead a discussion on, but I'll make my discussion very quick because those articles can really be summed up in about 1 or 2 sentences. And then I'll kind of put a bow on everything and wrap up all the information for the course. I will get through all your article critiques that have not yet been graded. I'll get through those as quickly as I possibly can. And again, as a reminder, if you want to replace one of your discussion board, one of your Canvas essay grades, you can always do discussion board number 6. And then what I will do is just replace the grades. I see we've had about, I think, 9 people who've done that. And I've already gone back and replaced the grades. So I will replace your lowest discussion board grade with the grade on number 6. So I think that's about it in terms of housekeeping items. So are there any questions or anything at all?
Hi, Professor, quick question. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brian.
Professor, which article is not going to be covered today that was supposed to be?
The medical marijuana article.
Okay.
I question, if we are not able to cover the presentations today, what time would class be on Saturday?
If we're not able to get through the presentations today, I think we'll probably need to start class about 11 o'clock on Saturday. I have, as I mentioned to you before, I have cohort number 24 that's beginning their program at 9 a.m. And so that'll be a relatively short session. So I think we probably could start up at about 11 a.m. But we'll see how we proceed tonight.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. I don't think I'm seeing Allegra in yet. Allegra, are you here? Don't think so. So instead, I think we'll then start with the Federalism by Waiver article, and that one belongs to Rosa. So I've enabled screen sharing in case you want to use that, but I'll turn the floor over to you, Rosa.
Good evening. Thanks. All right, so I'm going to talk about the article Federalism by Waiver, Medicaid, and the Transformation of Long-Term Care by Frank Thompson and Courtney Burke. The article discussed the transformation of the state's Medicaid program through federal waivers and used this program as an example to further evaluate the implication of Medicaid's waiver for federalism. The authors provide the use of federal waivers by the state, which grew over time and ultimately resulted in transformation of governmental relationship between federal and state governments to a type of federalism to provide more flexibility to the states to shape their program based on their demographic and specific needs of their own state. The federal waiver were included in the legislation, which delegated authority to the executive branch to deviate from the law within certain boundaries. The use of these waivers, particularly the 1915C waiver, enabled the executive branch to allow individual states to overcome Medicaid's institutionalization bias and implement home and community-based services. The widespread use of federal waivers eventually resulted in further involvement of legislative branch through vertical learning and vertical policy diffusion. The authors argue that the proliferation of these waivers suggests a tendency for a shift in the intergovernmental relationship between the federal and state governments from picket fence federalism to executive federalism. And then the article discussed the effectiveness of 1915C waivers in transforming Medicaid and the implication of Medicaid's devolution on federalism and federal and state intergovernmental relationships. So by any chance, do you guys know if Medicaid is an entitlement program or is it a capped grant program? Do you guys have any idea?
I think it's an entitlement program.
That is correct. It is Medicaid is an entitlement program, was enacted by Congress. Thank you. Sorry, I can't see the names out. On Congress, it was enacted by Congress in 1965 to provide health care to low-income families. It is a joint program by the federal government and individual states. The federal government provides a percentage of funding needed and provide guideline for the administration of the program. Provides guideline for the administration of the program. The states create the program and use federal waivers to better align their programs with their needs while they maintain the compliance with the federal mandates. One of the waivers that the states have used is from Section 1115 of the 1962 Social Security Act, which is known as a demonstration waiver. And the other waiver is from Section 1915 of 1981, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which is known as program waivers. So do you guys know the difference between demonstration waivers and program waivers? If not, I'll go to it. It's okay. So 1115 is demonstration waiver, and the 1915 is a program waiver. Demonstration waiver is primarily for policy learning and a required formal evaluation by the federal government. And then 1915, which is a program waiver, is in program intent to give the states more freedom in creation and administration of alternative healthcare delivery and payment methods. The article identifies 3 major periods in past decades, starting from the inaction of program waiver in 1981. The takeoff period was during the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration, the rapid expansion period during Clinton presidency, and then the third period was the continued growth under George W. Bush administration. During the first period, during the takeoff period, executive branch was concerned about growing use of waivers and tried to embed it by imposing a cold bed rule. Have you guys heard about the cold bed rule that was imposed in 1980? So the cold bed rule, it required the states to show that for each home community-based service waivers participant, they had to empty an institutional bed. They actually made it harder for states to use this waiver. They made it really lengthy and involved intense bargaining and negotiation. But then in Clinton's administration took the opposed approach and eliminated the cold bed rule and made it easier for the states to obtain the waivers. During this period, a ruling by the Supreme Court resulted in an even more supportive approach by the federal government toward giving the states more liberty to deinstitutionalize healthcare and provide more funding for HCBS. During the third period, Bush administration started an effort to identify the barriers to provide community-based healthcare services and facilitate the use of funds for the cash and counseling model, which enabled the recipient to pay their friends and relatives as their caregiver. In addition, I believe Bush administration supported the legislative branch in enacting the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, which among other provisions gave the state more option to provide HCBS without applying for the permits, which represented a vertical policy learning accomplished through the lesson learned through successful use of federal waivers in the past years. The article compares the number of waivers used by conservative states, a liberal state, and pace-setting states, and find it appealing to these varying types of political ideology with different financial approaches. The author clarified that despite the significant growth in the use of 1915 waivers, some states still lag and have not cured the institutionalization bias of Medicaid. They further clarify that they are not sure if HCBS would have failed to grow without federal waivers. Despite the support for HCBS by both Democratic and Republican president, the Republican president and Congress tried really hard to convert Medicaid from entitlement to a capped grant, but they were not successful. The use of federal waivers, along with the provision of the 2005 Deficit Reduction Act, have altered some characteristics of Medicaid's entitlement status compared to other entitlement policies and programs. For example, the states focus on certain geographics and demographics has resulted in inequality within Medicaid and variation in Medicaid's benefit within the states. The successful use of federal waivers by the state for their Medicaid program show the importance of the consideration of such a flexibilities by the legislators while they make the law. So here I want to talk about one of the concern of full-fledged entitlement. Do you guys know why it was such a big concern to have this about having this concern about having HCBS as a full-fledged entitlement? We know it's a entitlement program and well, it's costly. So one of the main concern about this, the article calls it the woodwork effect, and they say it's a very valid concern since the studies have determined that a large percentage of the people who otherwise qualified for HCBS services are cared for by their unpaid caregiver. In addition to the huge cost of the woodwork effect, the shortage of home health workers is another big concern for politicians who are reluctant to support unrestricted entitlement for Medicaid. Another aspect of the use of federal waivers for Medicaid is the impact it has had on the entitlement, as well as the impact on the administration of the federal law, which has shifted more from absolute compliance with the requirements that are detailed in the law by the legislative branch toward giving the executive branch authority to make key decisions about the program. Also, in addition, the use of waivers and the liberation of the state to design their program as they desire has impacted the requirements that are typical for entitlement programs. There is no cap on the amount of funding that the states may need. However, the states target certain geographic and demographic and do not necessarily need to provide unlimited capacity for the program, nor it is illegal for them to have inequality within different parts of states. This is due to the nature of the 1915C waiver, which targets a certain range of services. The authors have provided insight into the reasons for the willingness and preference of the politicians to allow allow and facilitate the use of 1915C waiver more than the use of 1115 waiver. Unlike 1915C waiver, which are frictionless, 1115 waivers still requires intense negotiations and take time to renew because they involve evaluation by the federal government. 1915C waivers are for routine purposes, but 1115 waivers are used to study unknown outcomes. In addition, Supreme Court has already ruled on the use of 1915C waiver, but not on 1115. And also, the article then used Medicaid's transformation to argue that federalism may need to move away from picket fence federalism and transform into executive federalism, which requires the federal government to provide grants without getting too much into the detail of how the states use these funds to address the ultimate goal of the programs and funding. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Camera turned off. Thank you very much, Rosa. Waivers are interesting, certainly in federalism, because they do provide the additional flexibility to state and local governments. And I agree with what Rosa said in her discussion. The one aspect of the article that really interested me was it was kind of a throwback to Moneypenny. If you remember in the Moneypenny article, how Moneypenny talked about we had categorical grants because grants were easier to get through Congress than getting a law through Congress. In order to get a law through Congress, you had to have specificity of aim. Excuse me, you had to have a very strong coalition in order to do that. There's something similar here in this article where whenever you have a logjam in Congress, you have gridlock in Congress, it's difficult to get these changes to laws passed through Congress. And so what is an easier route? An easier route is for the granting of these waivers. And I think that's why we've seen more of these waivers being granted during a time of partisan divides in Congress. Waivers can be very helpful to state governments by providing with that flexibility. One of the problems is whenever a state is successful with the use of their waiver, sometimes the federal government will look at that and say, well, it worked for this state, and so therefore it should work for all states. And then takes this very isolated success that this state had using this waiver and then applies it writ large to the entire nation. And sometimes what is good for California is not good for Arkansas and vice versa. The discussion of these waivers within the context of an entitlement program is also very significant because we always are concerned about entitlement programs and the growth in these entitlement programs. And one of the primary reasons why we are so concerned about entitlement programs is that they are mandatory spending. And so rather than being discretionary spending that Congress has direct control over, they are mandatory spending, which means Congress cannot directly reduce the amount of money that's being spent on an entitlement program. Instead, what Congress has to do is it then has to go through the eligibility process. It has to change the eligibility requirements in order to spend less money on that program. If it was a discretionary program, it could go through the normal appropriations process. Entitlement programs, which are mandatory spending, need to go through the authorization process. And so there's not as much of a direct route for Congress to reduce spending on entitlement programs as they would be able to with discretionary programs. And so once you start adding these waivers in, one of the reasons is that it's difficult for us to just on a large scale increase spending on these mandatory programs or decrease spending on these mandatory programs. Waivers are oftentimes a good device to try and get around that problem of entitlement programs being part of mandatory spending. And I'll stop there, but we do see a use of a lot of waivers by the federal government. And again, the big danger is when the federal government sees success in a state and then just assumes that that success will apply across the entire country. Okay, thank you, Rosa, for that. Let's now move on to our next article. We'll just go down the list to, now we're going to move out of the O'Toole textbook. And the next article is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act article, and that one belongs to Marissa.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, guys, so bear with me. We're going to be talking about a really fun topic, taxes, specifically the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017. So the article is called Trying Not to Lose Ground, State and Local Government Advocacy During Passage of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by J. Wesley Leckrone. So this article looks at the Trump administration's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed by Congress and signed by President Trump in 2017. This is actually the most major tax reform since the tax reform of 1986 under the Reagan administration. However, unlike the 1986 reform, which was passed by a more, I would say, bipartisan coalition, the TCJA was highly partisan and received no Democratic support in either the Senate or the House. So it was Republican-led, not primarily Republican-led, but Republican-led. So intergovernmental lobbying groups really had to be on the defense from the beginning to not only push the policy priorities of their state and local officials, but they also had to do that in a really highly partisan, intense environment. So while the article does give a brief overview of the changes that occurred with the tax reform, I'll go over some of the highlights. For example, some of the changes that happened for individual income tax, for individuals and their income tax, the tax brackets and rates were changed. So generally they were lowered, the tax rates were lowered for individuals. So across the board were generally lowered. The standard deduction and personal exemptions were well, the standard deduction was significantly increased, actually, and personal exemptions were eliminated. So the point of this was to simplify the tax filing process. The child tax credit was expanded, which provides a higher credit per qualifying child. And another impact for individuals is that the mortgage interest deduction, they did reduce the limit on deductible mortgage debt. And then as far as corporate tax changes, the biggest one for sure is that the corporate tax rate was reduced from 35 to 21%. So this was aiming to, in their words, enhance corporate competitiveness and help American business. But those are some of the changes that the author went through. But honestly, what the article primarily focuses on, yes, it does focus on the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But what it really is looking at is this tax reform legislation from a more intergovernmental perspective, and it examines the various state and local advocacy groups that fought very hard to try to influence and shape the final product of the act. And the author does present examples of issues that the group succeeded in, and then others in which they essentially took a significant hit or a loss. So these two big issues that the author focused on that I will be focusing on a little bit more too are, one, the potential elimination of state and local taxes deduction, otherwise known as SALT. And then two, the preservation of the tax exempt status of municipal bonds interest. So I know that kind of sounds like just a bunch of random words right now, but I will go into a little bit more detail later when we have those relevant discussion questions. But ultimately, the article not only delves into some specifics of the actual tax reform itself, but also what makes an intergovernmental lobbying successful, as found by the author, and then by using the TCJA as a case study, essentially. So my first question for you guys is, what are your initial thoughts or perspectives on the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? What do you know about it, if anything?
Okay, I'm totally jumping in on this because I'm a homeowner, and
Mhm.
this definitely affected our home ownership. California just has high property taxes, and it just made it so that we couldn't take full deductions of what we needed to pay and or what we had been paying. And so it definitely took a hit for us, especially because we are a two income family, but no kids. So we didn't have that deduction for the kids. And don't really have a lot of ability to do deductions otherwise, other than our home. So this was definitely a huge loss for us. And I know there was a lot of uproar in our community about it, and definitely a lot of groups talking about it, a lot of contacting local representatives. And so when it passes, it's definitely a financial blow.
Thank you for sharing, Estelle. So yeah, for the individuals that are homeowners, they were definitely affected by this act, with the mortgage deduction that I mentioned, but also a bunch of other deductions, which again we'll go into. But a lot of deductions were either eliminated or capped, and so what you used to be able to claim for deduction is you can no longer do that. And then especially in a high tax state like California, it disproportionately really affects taxpayers here. Anyone else have any thoughts or perspectives on the act? I was in college when it passed, so honestly, I was not paying attention. I was just, focusing on college. And personally for myself, I'm not a property owner. So I haven't really taken the time to I don't know, inspect my tax returns and whatnot and see how it affects me. But has anyone else seen anything either positively or negatively affect them because of this act?
Hey Marissa, thanks for sharing. Like yourself, I didn't really notice anything about it in 2017. I didn't buy my home until 2020. And so far, tax-wise, I've been able to deduct quite a few things. I'm not sure if it's less than when they actually passed the act, because like I said, I wasn't aware of what was cut. But my wife works from home, so we're able to deduct her office and her coffee, and if we buy whatever for the house, we're able to deduct it. I'm not sure if the tax guy knows loopholes or something, but it's been so far so good. I got money back.
Okay, so more positive experience then. Anyone else?
Well,
Sorry to cut somebody off. I think the only thing that I remember was the increase in the standard deduction. I wasn't a property owner. I'm not a property owner, so I didn't see any effects there. But I think I do remember getting a slightly bigger tax refund.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so let's actually move away from taxes for a second. We're going to talk a little bit more about intergovernmental lobbying in general, and kind of what the author found were, he calls them mechanisms, but basically 4 different mechanisms that the author found to be what makes intergovernmental lobbying more likely to be successful. So it's basically 4 preconditions or 4 standards that if an intergovernmental lobby group or advocacy group is meeting, that they're more likely to see success in what they are pushing for in federal legislation. So the first one is if the group maintains a unified front, so that they create the impression that there is an official state and local position on an issue. And so the article actually the author actually examined, I think, about 54 different lobbying groups that did end up forming various different coalitions. And although a lot of groups, local groups will have very vast differences in other ways, such as regional differences. They might have completely different ideologies, different populations, different internal dynamics, different parties, political parties. But what they can do is form coalitions, which is they kind of gather around one main issue that they want to present a unified front on. So my question is, have you had any experience where a coalition was successful in getting what they wanted? So a coalition of different groups, maybe different unions, but people with different interests, but also one big main interest. And was it successful or was it not? Anyone like to share?
Hi, Marissa. Sorry, could you clarify what was the question?
Yeah, so do you have any experience or have you been a part of a coalition? So basically, one large group made of many different groups that all, like, they may have been different groups from different areas, different localities, but they all fought for one particular priority issue.
Oh yeah, I have experience with that. So I'm working right now with the labor union, and they recently had for the LAUSD, they had a strike that was happened earlier in spring of last year, where they walked off on the job and they all unified to for their priority, which was wage increases to get out of the poverty line and for better benefits. So there are opportunities where differences can come aligned in the coalition and like a group as a union to get a unified interest.
Yeah, I agree. I think most of us, if we do have any experience with coalitions, is probably union, like a labor movement or union organization at our jobs. Personally, as for myself too, I actually work for LAUSD, so I was there when the SEIU strikes were happening, and I was in HR, or am in HR. So it was an interesting position to be in because I don't know, I just felt kind of evil, but they essentially got what they wanted. And a lot of those unions are made up of so many different classifications and so many different types of people, different wages and salaries and walks of life. And I'm sure they've had internal conflict within themselves, but they were able to mobilize and create quite a ruckus. Like the superintendent had a really big job on him, but they created a lot of noise and they were able to accomplish their goal, which was higher pay, better benefits, and a few other things. But yeah, no, so I agree. Thank you, Brian. And then anyone else? Any experience?
I guess I also have some experience in this. So my agency, along with totally different topic, by the way, along with a few other agencies in not just Orange County, but also the state, kind of got together to really make it known that to them, and I'm in water, that to them, flushing or encouraging flushable wipes is something that is, damaging to the sewer pipe system, and then to like different municipalities, affecting like local and city and um state agencies. And so they got together, and it's actually been an ongoing issue for a few years. And just, I believe, like last year or 2 years ago, they finally were able to pass something that states that these big companies like Kirkland or Huggies and stuff like that have to put some sort of messaging on their packaging that says that even though it says flushable, they really should not be put down the toilet, and they should be disposed of in trash receptacle. So that was kind of my experience where it's like you kind of see like some power in numbers.
Okay, yeah, no, definitely. All like different agencies coalescing around one major priority issue. Yeah, the same concept as like, for example, unions getting together. And that actually is a little bit more relatable to what happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which did have several local and state agencies all across the country creating coalitions to push for their interests. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Belen. I'm gonna
So,
move.
Marissa,
Oh,
I had a quick
yeah.
question earlier on the tax reform. You said it was Republican led. Do you know what was the major opposition that the Democrats stated that they were in opposition of it?
Yeah. So I was actually going to go into that a little bit later, but I can go over a little bit. So the biggest criticisms of the act by, mostly Democratic congressional members is that there is an impact on income inequality. So some critics do say that this act is contributing to worsening income inequality by providing more significant tax cuts for higher income individuals and corporations, which potentially does exacerbate our socioeconomic disparities. There's also the issue of the long-term fiscal impact. The act actually does cause a $1.46 trillion deficit. And, you know, depending on how you see it, you might see that as a good thing. That's $1.46 trillion of tax cuts, or that's $1.46 trillion of debt. So that was one of the bigger criticisms as well. There's like a lot more, but those are the ones that the author did mention. Does that answer your question, Brain?
Yeah, thank you, Marissa.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next one. We talked about the first mechanism, which is that organizations and advocacy groups should maintain a unified front, even if they have a bunch of different interests and other topics or issues. If they can create a unified front on one large issue, then it's more effective. The second mechanism is providing policy expertise on the effects of potential or existing policies, assists the deliberative process, and helps federal officials make informed decisions in line with state and local priorities. In other words, basically, this is when intergovernmental groups and lobbying groups do have kind of a advantageous position in that they can be the ones that provide the information on issues to their congressional members. Just a quick example, when I was in college, I actually interned at the US Capitol as an intern. And as interns, they would like encourage us to go to different informational sessions. And I quickly gathered that most of these were conducted by lobbying groups, and they would present data and reports and, you know, hand out like actual report booklets or brochures or pamphlets or whatever with the information regarding a certain issue, such as gun control or women's reproductive rights, whatever issue, they had basically their version of the information. And so a lot of congressional members, they go to these, or they have their staff go to these to gather the information that they need for, you know, upcoming legislation, because there's so many issues and there's so much information that they can't possibly, you know everything or read it, you know, just have 100% knowledge of everything. So that is what that is referring to. And then the third mechanism is if intergovernmental groups can harness a member of Congress with a pivotal vote to agree with their cause, they have a higher likely chance of succeeding. So this would be, for example, if there is some kind of legislation where maybe the tide will turn if one Republican or one major Democrat, like the Speaker of the House or minority leader, decides to, like, if the group is able to get their vote, that person is so influential amongst their peers that it would cause them to basically convince their peers also to take that side. So that is the third mechanism that intergovernmental lobby groups can use. And then the final and fourth mechanism is just high profile publicity. So sometimes advocating directly to our elected officials just doesn't work to be, you know, like they might have a very firm stance on something or stubborn or whatever it might be. So creating a PR campaign, media campaigns, really actually can put a lot of public pressure on elected officials to vote a certain way. And so that could be, and especially, I mean, that could be in the form of state and local officials putting more pressure on the federal officials, or it could be people calling into their congressman's or congresswoman's office and, you know, demanding they vote a certain way. So yeah, so those are the four. So my question is, of these four, which again, I'll repeat, 1 is a unified front, 2 is providing information to elected officials, 3 is harnessing the vote of an influential member of Congress, and 4 is high profile publicity. Which do you believe is the most effective? I mean, not that I'm saying there is one that is more effective or not, but what do you think is the most effective?
I would say, Marissa, I would say number 4. I think public pressure, as you see, a lot of things can become politicized because of the public. So, with social media or with the news coverage or actions, protests, I think that would be, my opinion, the most influential mechanism.
I agree with Brian. When I was working in nonprofit work, there was actually no, this is after I left, but there was a big movement called Save Our Children or something like that, as well as a movement to shut down this website that was targeting ways to do human trafficking on there. And so there was a lot of movement and discussions on from the public to shut this website down and to listen to this agency that was talking about saving the youth. Some of the information, though, that was being shared by those agencies was a little misguided. And so there's a double-edged sword there with public policy or public, I forgot what the term is, like public court. There is a good desire to make good, but sometimes the loudest voices aren't always the most informed. And so for this particular situation, the website was eventually taken down, which was great. However, that also drove a way to identify traffickers underground as well. And so although it was good, it was gone, it also made finding these individuals much more difficult. And then with the Save Our Children campaign, it kind of muddied up the waters of what trafficking was with conversations that were not actually trafficking. So it was really interesting to see that play in the public.
Yeah, no, thank you, Asel. You're right. I think that high profile publicity, because I think I'm apt to agree that that the 4th mechanism is probably the most effective in a way that elected officials are actually hearing their constituents' desires or their opinions. But I do also think that it can get out of hand very quickly, and maybe a coalition might be having some kind of targeted PR campaign, and it just kind of turns into something else. So yeah, no, I agree.
I would also say, just to add as a secondary option, I think the 3rd one with the party influence, because I think, as the Professor Powell mentioned, that now I think in modern times there's a lot of party unison, like a lot of people that are they vote strictly what down the line what their party is. So I think that also plays a huge influence in who they're following, because they can have their own constituents, but if they're going against the party, that then they can be, recalled or replaced. So that's also another pressure to, hey, the leader is the Speaker of the House is voting this way, so you have to kind of follow it too.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we'll move on from the intergovernmental lobbying now to the 2 big issues that arose within the Tax Cuts Jobs Act. These were the 2 issues where the author states that these coalitions were really aggressively fighting for or against. And so we'll take a look at them and also kind of what the result was. So the first one is, as I previously mentioned, is the SALT, which stands for state and local tax deduction. So this refers to the deduction that allows taxpayers in the US to deduct certain taxes paid to state and local governments on their federal income tax returns. So these taxes typically include state income taxes, local income taxes, and property taxes. So during the tax reform debates, there were significant changes made. The biggest one, and this was probably the biggest loss to a lot of coalitions that were fighting to keep the status quo, but it was a cap on deductions. So the final text of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act included a cap of $10,000 on the deductibility of state and local taxes. And that means that individuals can only deduct up to $10,000 of their total state and local taxes on their federal income tax returns. So as you can see, this probably would have very much panicked people from high tax states, which it did. So high tax states such as California, New York, New Jersey, they were particularly affected by this because they have high taxes. So now their individual taxpayers can only deduct up to 10,000 of the total state and local taxes, when sometimes that's not the case. It can be a lot more than 10,000 in states like that. Some people even argued that the cap should be removed altogether. The deduction should be removed altogether. They believe that the deduction disproportionately benefited wealthier individuals and high tax states. So the SALT deduction, it's controversial. It has implications for taxpayers, especially those in high tax states, who saw limitations on previously unlimited deduction. So my question is, have you, and we've kind of already gone over this since with the first question, but have you as an individual taxpayer felt the effects of the SALT cap specifically since it went in effect in 2018? Anyone like to share? If not, it's fine. We kind of did already talk about it, but I'm assuming, like, when Asal brought up, for example, the disadvantages of her tax situation with owning a property, I'm assuming a lot of that comes from this SALT cap. And then so some opponents of this SALT cap have argued that eliminating SALT is actually an attack on state sovereignty. Would you agree with this statement, and why or why not?
I think I would agree because at a certain point, it's eliminating or reducing the amount of taxes that they receive, and that does also lead to reduction in services, or in whatever they could allocate, because if they're receiving less. So maybe in a way that is because it is a way that kind of undercuts them, because now you can get more tax breaks that wasn't there before. So I would see it that way, but I don't know, maybe others could see it other way.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Brian. Yeah, so opponents of this cap and of eliminating SALT in general, they argue that eliminating or capping the SALT deduction would limit the ability of the state and local governments to develop and operate their own tax systems, just because they have to be cognizant of this $10,000 cap. And so before, when it was unlimited, the tax system, it was the state and local tax systems were more independent, you could say, from the federal tax system. But now they do have to be cognizant of this cap. Anyone else before we move on? Okay, so the second issue that the author talks about that coalitions really formed around and were either strongly opposed or for was the potential of municipal bonds, the interest becoming non-tax exempt. So the status quo is that they are tax exempt. So I'll explain a little bit as to what these are, because it's a bit of a complex topic, but municipal bonds are debt securities issued by state and local governments to fund various public projects such as infrastructure development, schools, hospitals, and other community projects. The interest earned by investors on these bonds is typically exempt from federal income taxes, making them an attractive investment option. So the tax exempt status of municipal bond interest serves as an incentive for investors to buy these bonds, which in turn helps state and local governments borrow money at a lower interest rate. And the author did talk about a few coalitions, specifically the National Governors Association and the Municipal Bonds for America Coalition. They were strongly opposed to the removal of the tax-exempt status, and they argue that tax-exempt bonds played a crucial role in financing infrastructure projects and maintaining a stable market for debt. Now, in this case, they actually won this battle. So municipal bond interest is still tax exempt, even under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So this is an example of coalitions and intergovernmental lobbying actually succeeding. But why do you think that the preservation of the municipal bond interest was deemed, I guess, a more worthy issue or more worthy, a more worthy issue to remain in our tax structure, whereas salt was essentially gutted? Okay, that's okay. So I can kind of go into that. So the reason that the municipal bond interest was more accepted, you could say, by Republican majorities in Congress, is because the municipal bond interest is really, it provides a universal benefit across all state and all local governments. And it was pretty much deemed worthy of saving. The same, though, was not perceived to be true with the SALT deduction. The Republican majority did believe that it disproportionately benefited high tax Democratic states. And so, because of the partisanship and ideology, that also contributed to the SALT cap. And they needed to find revenue. I mean, like I said, there was going to be $1.46 trillion in tax cuts. So they needed to find revenue somewhere to fund all these tax cuts, and gutting salt was the answer for them, because it not only, in their view, even the playing field amongst all the states, but it also, it you could say it kind of punished the states that were dominated by the Democrats instead. At least maybe some people would say that. But yeah, so other than that, pretty much the only thing left I had is, if anyone wants to contribute, how do you foresee that the federal tax situation will evolve over the years? Or what would you prefer is accomplished through intergovernmental lobbying, as far as tax reform?
Marissa, I want to go back to your previous conversation, and then I can jump in and answer what you just
Yeah, of
asked. It did seem that this particular legislation was partisan, and so it was like you mentioned that the SALT was really more so a benefit to Democratic high tax states, and so it almost seemed like you mentioned a punishment, but then we're going to also benefit this other way that is more of an avenue for businesses to make more revenue. And so it very much seemed like a punishment for maybe voting a certain way, and it had like a really funky taste to kind of experience it. And then to your point of what you just asked, oh gosh, and I just blanked out on what you asked. Can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and thank you for sharing. Just so you know, like, a lot of critics did dub the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 as trickle down economics on steroids. So you make a valid point. And then my next question was, how do you foresee that the federal tax situation will evolve over the next few years? Or what would you prefer is accomplished through intergovernmental lobbying on tax reform?
Thank you again for sharing that question. It seems like the way it could potentially go, it just really falls on what party's in line, but ultimately it seems like it would benefit corporations and those that are most likely on the more wealthy spectrum. It would be great if it went the other way and it benefited those that are on the lower socioeconomic status range, and just be more of an opportunity to be an equalizer as opposed to an income earner for some subsects.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing us, Sal. Anyone else? Okay. If oh, was someone gonna say something? No.
Yeah, Marissa, I'll just say one last thing. I guess when it comes to taxes, everybody should pay their fair share, and without getting into a major topic, I think that corporations get a lot of breaks and find a lot of loopholes. So if there's some way to even the playing field, I think that would be beneficial.
Okay.
Also, I would add, as you say, to foresee. So I think one of the ways, if you're not able to get the taxes, the other way they can get back is when they increase sales tax. I think that's the other way, or travel or whatever, tourism. I think those fees, you could see those increase if the other ones, there's some way there that gets offset. That's what I think.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
I was gonna say, now that we're going into tax season, I feel like I need to pay more attention. So your topic is very timely, Marissa.
That's exactly how I felt. I was like, let me take a look at these paychecks and see what they're taking out, because I don't feel like I'm too aware of that. But yeah, no, I agree. I think it's important, especially with tax season coming up. So you guys should take a look at your tax returns and see if there's any major changes.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, guys. So unless anyone else wanted to go. Okay, so I yield my time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marissa. I do apologize. My internet went out, and so I missed a couple of minutes. I apologize for that, but very well done. And this piece of legislation, as you pointed out, was a huge sea change in the way in which the tax structure exists. And it was a huge sea change, the biggest sea change since the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And the really interesting thing about the article for me is how it relates back to the Camissa article about how state governments work together in order to try and influence decisions at the national level. And Marissa, as you talked about, the two major goals of these intergovernmental groups, number one, the SALT deduction, and number two, maintaining the tax-exempt nature of municipal debt. And they won the second battle. They were able to keep tax-exempt nature of municipal debt, but the SALT deduction, eliminating that limitation on the SALT deduction, that was something they were not able to accomplish. And there is very much of a partisan element to all of this because, as we've talked about, California, New York, Massachusetts, high tax states, people who live in those high tax states were hurt much more by that $10,000 cap on the SALT deduction than people who live in lower tax states. And so a lot of people in California were shocked when they did their taxes that year or the next year, and they found out they could only deduct up to $10,000 in the taxes they paid to state and local governments. And it resulted in a big increase in the tax bill for a lot of those folks. And so it kind of shows us that when these governments work together, and as Marissa pointed out, when they're able to join together and advocate for something, they really give this unified front. And it really presents Congress with the idea that, well, all state governments are for this, or all state governments are against this. And so the more unified they can be, obviously, the more successful they are in lobbying Congress. So excellent. Thank you very much, Marissa. Really appreciate it. Well done. We'll move on to Sal's article, the voting reform article.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. And give me 1 second. All right. And is everybody seeing the one with the notes or the one without the notes?
I don't see anything else, though.
Oh, that's weird. And let me do this. Apologies for that. I was trying to get all technical with some different stuff, but apparently that didn't work. Well, while I figure out my technology, I did my article is on the alternative route to voting reform, the right to vote, voter registration, redistricting, and the U.S. Constitution. It was really interesting to read because there were so many things that happened over the course of the last several elections that were quite interesting to just see how how voting rights were I don't want to say attacked, but just how they were being fought over. And hopefully that's a better way of saying it. And how about now? Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, we see.
So this article, it was written in 2019, and it shed light on crucial aspects of voting reform, the often underestimated role of what the US Constitution, state constitution had in actually shaping the electoral process. And the authors made a compelling case emphasizing and exploring the provisions within the state constitution and how those could provide alternatives and potentially more effective avenues to advancing voting rights. So this perspective gained significance after the substantial effects that happened after the 2013 election. I'm sorry, the 2013 state, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank, the Shelby County v. Holder decision at the Supreme Court level. So in leading up to the 2020 election, that served kind of as a backdrop to their argument, where challenges to voting rights and election laws were so frequently happening. And this was because of the Shelby case. In this context, the author suggested that when the Supreme Court wasn't fully engaging with trying to protect these voting rights, it really was behooved to the people to turn over to the state constitutions to try to be strategic and protect these rights there. So the first part of the article kind of goes into the complexities of voting in the US, and the authors discuss the different variations in state constitutions, and some explicitly guaranteeing the rights to vote, while others were more vague. And they highlight the power of state legislators in shaping election regulations and touching on like recent voting right battles like voter ID requirements and ongoing debates and expanding or restricting ballot access. But overall, the authors underscored the significant role that states actually have in shaping voting rights altogether. The second part of the article explores the intricate world of gerrymandering, which it just kind of boggled my mind that you can go into elections with voting maps that are so skewed. And for those who don't know, gerrymandering is when voting district boundaries are manipulated for political gain. The authors kind of dive into the historical shifts that have happened, the Supreme Court decisions that have let this kind of go a little rampant, and recent cases on partisan gerrymandering. They also emphasize that the court's reluctance to jump in and indicate a preference on which way it should go really showed how the states had to come in and provide a solution. So it examines examples like how Florida and Pennsylvania had to use their own constitution to challenge gerrymandering. And it also advocates for state-driven solutions and highlights reform initiatives in other states like Arizona and California. I know we've heard recently how California, I think the governor just recently decided not to sign something for in nonpartisan gerrymandering review committee or something like that. So the article actually is like super long and just provides so much rich detail and description on the strategy for each of these different topics. And it's going to take so much more time than I have today to really go into it. So for this discussion, I'm just going to focus on the right to vote and voter registration. So my first question as I'm diving into this is interestingly, the Constitution provides a really high level overview surrounding the majority of the laws for voting, but it doesn't actually explicitly state who has the right to vote. So does anybody know where in the US Constitution we can find rules for anything to do with voting? And this is going back to the first class.
Hi, SL. So I think it's found mostly in the amendments, but there is a part, and I might be misquoting, but it's like Article 1, Section 8, maybe, that talks about how just elections in general, but it doesn't say who has the right to vote. Those came in the amendments, for example, like with the 13th, 14th, 15th, and the 19th amendments.
In fact, you are on fire. Definitely true. As you mentioned, the articles, there's 2 articles specifically that talks about this. The first article, Section 2, Clause 1, provides little guidance for the direct election of provides, sorry, a little guidance for the direct election of members of the House of Representatives, stating that they can be elected every second year by the people. And then another clause in Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, discusses the right of the administration of federal elections as to the time, the place, the manner of how they're holding the elections on senators and representatives. Also spot on, you have the 14th Amendment, which really is the amendment for Equal Protection Clause and extends citizenship to all natural born or naturalized Americans, regardless of your race, and guaranteed that rights of citizenship like voting cannot be restricted in states. As you mentioned, the 15th Amendment also prohibits restricting the right to vote due to race. The 19th Amendment extends voting rights to all women, which is a really important one for me. And there's also a couple other ones. Anything stand out for anyone else?
Sorry, me again. But it would be the amendment regarding poll taxes. I don't remember if it was 22 or 26.
Yeah, it's the 24th Amendment, which it explicitly bans poll taxes. I'm just impressed that you would even remember it was in the 20s.
I love elections.
Anyone else? We got two more out there.
The 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age, right? To 18?
Absolutely, down to 18 and older. And so that's kind of an important one. You're thinking about your high school age youth who are thinking maybe of potentially joining the Army or what to do with their life. They also have the opportunity to be able to vote. And then the last one is the 17th Amendment, which requires states to elect senators by popular vote. So as you can see, it's not very prescriptive on who, but it kind of gives some guidance on how and when. And then the amendments go further into making protections. And so the founders appeared to have delegated a lot of the responsibility for the administration of elections to state governments, but did reserve for Congress some of the powers to regulate federal elections as needed. Congress has rarely used this power, typically letting states and local governments kind of do their own thing and run their elections as they see fit. As you notice, in California, we have very easy access to voting by mail, and then other states kind of restrict those accesses. So every state kind of has the ability to do what they think is going to be best for their constituents. So in the 230 years since the ratification of the US Constitution, Congress has passed very few laws aimed at protecting citizens' access to the ballot box. How many laws did the article say that Congress has passed since the ratification of the US Constitution? It was like a one sentence in there, so this is going to be a little bit of a tricky one. I would say you get a Starbucks if you knew the answer, but then I'd be lying.
I don't quite remember SL, which is embarrassing because I did my article critique on this article. But was it like 17 maybe or 13?
Oh my gosh, you're so close. You got the 7 part. So it was 7 articles or 7 laws that were passed. So great job, Eva. You get that virtual coffee your way. So here are the 7 laws that were passed since the U.S. Constitution has been ratified 230 years ago. Some of these are ones that I kind of knew off the top of my head, like the Voting Rights Act. I've heard of that over and over, but others I didn't know. So does anybody want to take a gander at what these are? And obviously you don't have to go into detail on what the specific year was.
Is this I'll say, is this more like about the accessibility in terms of voting? Because I remember the Voting Accessibility Act for Elderly and Handicapped 1984. I was 2 years old when that happened, but I do remember that being a big deal. Just I don't remember, but learning about it later, the ability for people with handicap issues being able to access voting areas so they could submit their votes. And I know with the Civil Rights Act, opening up, ensuring that there were equal rights to voting. So, I mean, it really seems all about accessibility, but I could be wrong.
No, Melissa, thank you for sharing. You're spot on. To touch on the first one that you discussed, the voting accessibility for elderly and handicapped, that required accessible polling places and accommodations for elderly and handicapped voters. So think of individuals that needed to have a ramp, ADA accessibility, or individuals that needed to have different type of accessibility needs for the elderly. So you're definitely right on and spot on that. And then I think you also said the Civil Rights Act, right?
Yeah, that's the one I vaguely remember. I should know more about that, but yes.
You know, I'm sure we all should know more about each of these, but you know, here, this is why we're here today. So the Civil Rights Act was renumerated several times, and it provides some of the early federal statutory protections against discrimination in voting, defining citizenship and affirming that all citizens are equally protected by the law. So the later versions also protected the constitutional civil rights of many African Americans to vote. Think of the civil rights era, where a lot of this was more of a ramp up to help protect rights of those that were disenfranchised. Has anybody heard of the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Balloting Act? These are a mouthful, by the way.
No, I haven't heard of that. But I'm guessing just based off the name, the ability to vote, you know, when you're away. And the only reason I think of this is because I had a friend who was Peruvian and they were required to vote in their national elections or no matter where they were in the world. And so they would set up polling places everywhere. And I'm just wondering if they're able to like mail in their vote.
Yeah, I think the name really does lend itself to kind of understand what it is. And it's exactly what you're sharing, Melissa. It required that states and territories allow members of the uniformed services serving away from their home and as well as their family members and US citizens residing outside of the country, like your friends, to register to vote absentee in federal elections. And that one kind of went hand in hand with the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. This act was an amendment to that first one we just discussed, to establish voter registration procedures that states must follow for federal elections. So it just kind of expanded on the protections for those that were living overseas for some reason and are still US citizens. It improved voter opportunities for military and overseas voters through electronic delivery of ballots, which I think is such a critical piece. If you're moving from location to location, if you're in the military, I mean, imagine how many times your ballot might potentially get lost and you get disenfranchised because of a simple procedure of not, being able to get your ballot. Anything else stand out for anyone else?
For me, it's the National Voter Registration Act of 1983. I believe they call that one the Motor Voter Law, where you can register to vote when you're at the DMV, applying for your license, doing other paperwork. It allows you to opt in then and there.
That's exactly it. And I thought that little clever name was catchy. This is, when you receive your driver's license, as you mentioned, any public assistance as well. So you're trying to get SNAP benefits. You have disability services that you're trying to attempt, or any other government services. You at that point have the option to register to vote, which is just so important to know that these places are giving access and opportunity and knowledge to individuals like, hey, just so you know, this is where you can do this as well. What I really liked about the Motor Vehicle Act is that it really facilitated the opportunities to register to vote for young people that are under 18 that are still not yet at the legal age to vote, but it kind of gets them pre-registered, which is really neat. I think the other two that we didn't touch on were the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which established minimum standards for the states to follow for election administration issues, such as like what kind of voting machine standards and provisional voting. The other piece is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was definitely, amended several times, this prohibited discriminatory voting practices, especially in the South, and aimed to eliminate barriers for voting for African Americans. The amendments expanded and renewed provisions for the Voting Rights Act to counter voting discrimination. That's a really hefty legislation. It's very important for all of us as we continue to think about how our voting rights are protected. So the most significant, as I mentioned, is a VRA passed in 1965, and then on 4 different occasions reauthorized. And the intent of the act was to bring an end to the disenfranchisement of African American voters in the South states, as well as other jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination for voting and election laws. And despite the protections of the amendments we spoke of earlier, the 14th, the 15th, Southern states in the late 18th century and early 19th centuries passed a series of laws and constitutional provisions commonly referred to as the Jim Crow laws that ultimately segregated white and African American citizens in the region and disenfranchised African American voters altogether. So common provisions used to restrict African American suffrage included the grandfather clause, the poll tax, literacy/understanding tests, and then restrictions on felon voting. And so let's touch on what these 4 items are. Has anybody heard of these terms?
Yes.
You-
To elaborate, the grandfather clause, I believe, was if your grandfather voted, you're allowed to vote, but if they didn't, then you were not. Felon voting, if you had been, sorry, I guess I should go. Oh, no, I guess I'll give someone else a chance.
I love it, Eva. Let's talk about grandfather clause for a little bit. It did give the legal provision that was enacted in some southern U.S. states during the Jim Crow era, and it exempted individuals, as you mentioned, from being able to vote. And so these stringent voting requirements mentioned that if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote before the Civil War, they were allowed to vote. And this clause disproportionately benefited white voters while making sure that African American voters whose ancestors were enslaved and therefore ineligible before the war were not able to vote. A note on this term: this is actually considered a controversial term due to the nature of its origin, and a more appropriate word that would depict the same determination, but without the kind of racist undertones that come with it, is like a legacy. So I know I find myself constantly saying, oh, that's a grandfather. You got grandfathered in for whatever. And I have to remind myself where that term came from and what it really means and how it actually affected so many individuals, taking away their voice. Thank you, Eva, for jumping in on that one. Anybody else care to gander on what the other ones are?
I'll cover poll taxes. Basically, it was a way to charge a fee in order to vote to price out the poor.
Absolutely, spot on. So these fees were imposed as a prerequisite, right? So it's a fee to vote altogether. So during the Jim Crow era, some southern states implemented this poll tax as a way to keep certain people from voting. And as you can imagine, they were definitely targeting the Black vote. The taxes were deliberately set at levels that many Black citizens just couldn't afford, creating this weird financial barrier to not be able to let people's voices heard. Alabama implemented a poll tax in 1901. And let's pause. And yes, I am talking about 1901. I'm taking us way back. It required voters to pay $1.50 to cast their ballot. And if you adjust this for inflation, this amount would be equivalent to over $45 today. The intention was really to just impact Black citizens and their power to vote and their voice, and many of whom were already impoverished and couldn't afford that tax. Thanks, John. What about a literacy test? I mean, it's in the name. You can kind of imagine what it is.
Voters would be required to know how to read, so they'd have to take a test in order to be eligible to vote. But this would, I mean, just knowing this would drastically impact those that are, were poor, were unable to, gain an education or learn to read. Also, immigrants would probably be heavily impacted by something like that.
Absolutely. These tests were often intentionally complex. And I mean, as you're hearing me talk, I'm stumbling, I'm stuttering. English is my second language, but I've been speaking it for a very long time. So it's almost my first, but I'm having issues speaking. And so imagine sitting there and trying to read something that's complex and it's your second language. It's definitely something that would keep people from being able to vote. In Mississippi, there were literacy tests that were notorious for their complexity and their bias. African American applicants were often asked to interpret these really convoluted and subjective passages of the state constitution. I don't know when the last time you all sat down and read the California state constitution. I can tell you I've never done that. I couldn't probably interpret it. It's so much legalese. And so the interesting part is that white applicants face simpler questions to this. And so it's not like it was a level playing field anyways to begin with. This definitely perpetuated racial disparities in voter registration. Okay, felon voting.
Estelle, if I can say one more thing.
Yeah.
When I was reading through this article, I was curious what these literacy tests look like. And so I pulled one up from Louisiana around like the 60s. And one of the questions was spell backwards forwards. Like these are confusing questions, or print the word vote upside down, but in the correct order.
Oh, geez.
So it's kind of, I mean, this was within the last 100 years that these things were being administered. And as you said, they were definitely confusing on purpose.
I mean, it almost reminds me. Sorry, go ahead.
I did the same thing as EFOT. I started looking it up and like just a sample test, and I couldn't pass this today if I tried to take it. I mean, it's like one of the questions is in the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L, and all the circles are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's like, it just, yeah. Anyway, just wanted to add that in.
You know, it almost reminds me of doing a sobriety field test when you're sober, but you're so nervous and you're shaking in your boots and you know you've not done anything wrong, but yet you're still answering questions like you've done something wrong. Like I can't even imagine being asked to spell certain things backwards in situations like that. So thank you both for sharing that. So going to felon voting, there is something that happened in Florida a few years ago in an election. I think it might have been 2020 regarding felon voting. Does anybody know? So just off the top, felons in a lot of states are not allowed to vote, or there's a lot of restrictions on voting. So laws that disenfranchise individuals with criminal convictions keep their voice from being heard. Now, we can definitely get into conversations on, do they deserve to vote? Do they not deserve to vote? They committed crimes, all of that nature. And that is definitely a valid conversation to have. But in this situation, these laws are disproportionately affecting African Americans, as law enforcement and judicial systems are often biased against them. So felony disenfranchisement has contributed to a really broad effort to limit the political influence of Black citizens. And so again, going back to 1901, Alabama's constitution denied the right to vote to any person found guilty of a crime involving moral turpitude. And the article kind of went a little into this. And it said in the Jim Crow South, this meant that many African-American voters were disenfranchised for infractions like loitering or public intoxication. So imagine not being able to cast your ballot because you were found drinking in public. And I know myself in my 20s, and I could definitely get a ticket for that. And then imagine not being able to vote the rest of my adult life because of a silly situation like that. Recently, in federal district court in Alabama, in the case of Thompson v. Alabama, it prompted the state legislature to enact a law that more clearly defined what moral turpitude did in hopes that the court would dismiss this case. However, the federal court has allowed plaintiffs to proceed with their challenge. So as you can see, even though the states are trying to, people are trying to use the states' constitutions and states' opportunities to change voting, it still comes across as a little difficult in some locations. And then going back to Florida, so in 2020, Florida passed an election, actually it was 2018, aimed to restoring voting rights to certain to felons. And so I think this was a big push to help in bringing people out to vote in 2020. But subsequent legal battles and legislative changes have influenced its implementation. So, for example, certain felons got the right to vote, but now you got to pay your fees before you get a chance to vote. So it's like an equivalent of poll taxes. So as I mentioned before, the VRA established protections for voters. However, the Shelby case impacted these protections. So my question to you all is, what is the significance of the 2013 Shelby County v. Holder ruling? This case is kind of a big deal. So this case ended up removing the VRA's provisions that the federal government needs to be pre-approving any voting changes in jurisdictions known for discriminatory voting practices. So Shelby is a seminal voting rights case that ultimately dismantled any essential protections that the Voting Rights Act had. And the case has actually devastated the impact of voting rights and redistricting. And so it's been very, very detrimental to certain people in different locations that were particularly disenfranchised to begin with. So the ruling immobilized the pre-clearance process. And what that means is that in certain regions, anytime you wanted as a state to change the way that you were going to be voting, disseminating the voting process, you had to get a pre-clearance from Congress in order to enact that. And so Shelby took that restriction away. It was particularly targeting states and counties and cities that were historically racially discriminating by requiring certain processes to be put in place. And however, the Supreme Court just found that this rule was unconstitutional. And the authors did give an opinion that apparent conservative shift in the court in the wake of Justice Anthony and Justice Anthony Kennedy's retirement and the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh in 2018, that kind of signified a shift in the Supreme Court that emphasized how they just weren't going to get involved. And Congress's failure to address any of these pre-clearances issues signal a desire to push these fights to the state. So the authors were definitely saying that because of Shelby, people were trying to get creative to protect votes. And so what are modern barriers or modern examples of barriers that continue to disenfranchise people and populations?
I guess one that comes to mind is the elimination of same-day voter registration in certain states and localities.
Absolutely. And that has happened in a couple different places. None of this stuff was covered in the article, so please feel free to chime in with your own experiences. But yeah, you're correct, Ifath, is definitely being able to take away the right to just sign up the same day that you're wanting to vote. That's been really helpful for other states to get the vote out.
There's the movement, or there is a movement to restrict like mail-in voting. I know that makes voting accessible to quite a few that wouldn't typically vote, and so that movement to restrict accessibility to that.
Very true. So 2020 was kind of an instrumental year in expanding the voting through mail because of the pandemic. And we saw a lot of states that weren't part of mail voting kind of feel that this is the way that they had to do it in order for public safety. Well, now the tide has turned and you see a lot of states that originally didn't have vote by mail available who are now kind of rescinding or scaling back the opportunity for people to do that. Anybody vote by mail by any chance?
I do. I love it.
Yes.
I do too. In Orange County, we all automatically get our voter ballot, the ballots by mail.
I started voting too, and it's amazing.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. Nancy, you wanted to share something?
Oh no, I was just agreeing that it's amazing to be able to vote by mail, especially given my work schedule.
Absolutely. I live very close to a voting location. I think it's about 3-4 miles away, and I still vote by mail just because of the convenience of it. Okay, so I heard this really random thing that was happening in Georgia where there was a law that was passed that you can't sell food or water to people waiting in line to vote. And I thought, well, okay, that kind of makes sense. But also, why would you put a rule like that? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Sometimes you have really long lines to vote. People get tired, get thirsty. And so, someone's, giving out any, water or food, it might sway the way they vote.
That's right, Cynthia. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and places there were hours and hours and hours of waiting to be able just to cast your ballot. And imagine you get there in the morning trying to beat the rush, and then you have 4 or 5 hours that you're just waiting in line. You're passing breakfast, you're passing lunch, you're starving. And what if the temperature is high? I mean, normally these big voting events happen in November, but still, like, you have weather that's happening. And so imagine just being told, well, if you want to go get something to eat and do something basic, like go to the bathroom, you're just gonna have to give up your spot in line and have to start all over again. What about ID requirements? Anybody heard of those?
Yeah, so voter ID laws, I know are that's a big hot topic because basically proponents of voter ID laws claim that, there will be some kind of fraud, but I'm pretty sure it's like been proven that there's very little evidence that there's voter fraud when it comes to specifically IDs. And it does disenfranchise certain sects of the population, including low-income voters. They might not have an ID or be able to pay for it. Transgender folks, that's a difficult name changes and all that. That's usually a difficult process. So yeah, voter ID laws, and that's still pretty present in a lot of states, if I remembering correctly.
Yeah, absolutely, Marissa. This is definitely a hot button item. And I mean, you think about how it can potentially affect people that are on the lower socioeconomic status. Maybe they can't afford to get an ID. Maybe they don't have transportation to get to the DMV. Maybe the DMV is 2, 3 hours away. And so this is definitely affecting certain subsects, as you mentioned, of individuals that just, aren't able to produce an ID. And although in theory it sounds great, just show who you are, show proof that you can vote. It really actually is a way to keep people from voting. A couple of other things that kind of popped up for me is, having a voting day that is not a national holiday. I mean, I think it would be great if for places that don't have vote by mail, to just have a national holiday to go out and vote. I mean, we have jobs sometimes that give you the opportunity to go vote, and that's paid time off, but there's a lot of jobs that don't do that. And so imagine the individuals that have to think of, well, I have to, skip a day of work, wait in these long lines if I'm in a state that has long lines or few polling places. And I have to give up work and I have to give up my income. So maybe having a day where it's a national holiday and everybody just gets to take the day off, or it's a couple different days and you all get to go at different times. The other one that is really controversial, but I know that New Zealand does this, is giving legal residents the right to vote. So in the US, you have to be a citizen, born or naturalized, to be able to vote. And anybody else is not afforded that opportunity. But I have a cousin in New Zealand who became a resident and she was able to vote. And I just thought that was really fascinating. So I wanted to end this by just, talking about restricting the right to vote, and wanted to provide an opportunity for anybody who, you feel moved to register. If you haven't registered, you want to use your voice to vote. With this being an election year, you may want to exercise your right. You don't, it's totally up to you. But if you are always curious to figure out how and where to go, you can just put your camera on this QR code and it will take you to the California online registration, and you can just register right there, and it's all different languages. So if you were on the fence and you wanted to learn how to do it, please feel free to take a gander at that website. And I just wanted to thank everybody for listening and participating in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aseo. Very well done. That's outstanding. There's really not a whole lot left for me to say. You covered all the important points of the article. I really do think it, and going to those two articles I'm going to talk about later on tonight, the State of American Federalism articles. One of the themes that comes out of those articles is that voting rights is probably going to be the primary federalism issue in the near future. And what we have seen is we have seen instances, as you have discussed, with the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, where the national government has seen state governments kind of abuse their control over elections. In the Constitution, states are given control over the scheduling and conduct of their elections, and we've seen that being abused. And that's why we ended up with the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and then in the 24th Amendment to eliminate poll taxes. I think now we are seeing some of that abuse again, in that we are seeing states purging voter rolls. We've seen some areas closing polling places, and so there's only one polling place for an entire 800,000 people. We've seen, the elimination or the attempt to eliminate drop boxes and the attempt to eliminate mail-in voting, as everyone had already previously discussed. And so I think this is really the battleground that we're going to be looking at over the next few years. The Supreme Court has been relatively hesitant to get involved in undoing partisan gerrymandering and undoing a lot of these state laws that have meant to try and reduce the ability of people to vote. There was a case I may have mentioned in this class before, but a case from last year, the Arkansas NAACP chapter versus the state of Arkansas. And it was a case in the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals that looked at the Voting Rights Act and the ability of individuals and groups to bring cases under the Voting Rights Act. And essentially the district court said, we don't have the jurisdiction to talk about this. And then it was appealed by the NAACP up to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. And essentially the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals said that individuals and groups such as the NAACP do not have legal standing to bring cases under the Voting Rights Act. The only individual, really, the only organization that can bring cases under the Voting Rights Act would be the Department of Justice, the federal level. And if the Department of Justice doesn't want to get involved in the case, then there's no standing for individuals to bring cases under the VRA. Now, that's only for the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, if that type of decision starts to be seen in other circuits around the country, that could have a very detrimental impact upon the Voting Rights Act and the ability to bring a case under the Voting Rights Act. Here in California, we have the California Voting Rights Act, and it has some differences between it and the Voting Rights Act at the federal level. Essentially, at the federal level with the Voting Rights Act, you need to demonstrate that there was some intention to, it's like a two-part test, we won't get into it, but you have to essentially show there was some intention on the part of the government to try and deny certain categories of people their right to vote for their representatives. Here in California, with the California Voting Rights Act, you don't have that. What's called Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act at the federal level, you don't have that same Section 2 here in the California Voting Rights Act. So it is much easier to bring a case under the California Voting Rights Act and to win that case than it is at the federal level. And in fact, very few, really no local governments have been able to successfully defend a CVRA case against them over the past several years. And so that's why you see a lot of local governments that are adopting even year elections, that are adopting district-based elections as opposed to at-large elections. But this is an extremely important article because voting rights, again, will be the central battleground, if you will, between the national and state governments over the next few years in federalism. But outstanding work, I say, very, very well done. Very important article and very well discussed. Okay, let's go ahead and take a short break tonight. Let's do about a 10-minute break, if that's okay with everyone. And we'll come on back at 7:50. When we come on back at 7:50, we have 3 articles left. We have the Governors in Control, Fiscal Federalism, and Economic Crisis. And then we'll circle back to the Entrepreneurial Cities article. So take 10 minutes, come back at 7:50, and we'll do our remaining 3 articles. Okay, everyone, we are back. That's our 10 minutes. So we will go ahead and get into our final three articles. I'm not turning my camera on because of my internet issues tonight. So hopefully by not having my camera on, I'll be able to save a little bit in terms of bandwidth. So next article up is the Governors in Control article, and that one belongs to Adolfo. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Okay, perfect. 1 second here. So my article was Governors in Control, Executive Orders, State Local Preemption, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to be going down memory lane here shortly. So just to give a little bit of a breakdown of what I'm trying to achieve tonight, there's going to be the introduction, a brief overview of the role of the governors in handling the COVID-19 crisis, the executive orders that were implemented and their importance, the impacts and responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, look a little bit into the state and local preemption, and then the governor's decision-making process. Near the end, I'll tie in some of the legal and constitutional aspects that the governors faced. In the end, I'll go over the items that were used for the study and some of the findings. And lastly, I'll wrap it up with the public reception and controversies, and also lessons learned and future preparedness for future crises. So in the face of absent leadership from Washington, D.C., governors were left at the helm to protect the citizens of their states, balance health, economic issues, secure protective equipment, and implement tough restrictions to combat the threat of COVID-19. The central point of this article was to identify whether governors opted for state and local preemption and chose to centralize power rather than empower local cities to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. So some important things to keep in mind was that this was an emergency situation where residents of the state turned to their governors for reassurance and solutions. Secondly, these actions were taken. Sorry, there's a car passing by. Perfect. Secondly, these actions were taken over a short period of time, limiting court action that is common in previous state preemptions. Third, many of these preemption directives were bipartisan, with both Republican and Democratic governors acting to close their states or to inhibit local actions. And lastly, these executive orders were not closely tied to corporate and other interests, as is common with preemption measures in other contexts. So how did they go about achieving this? So they utilized executive orders. So executive orders are directives issued by the head of a government branch, such as the president or in this case, the governor, that carry the force of the law. They form an executive action, and it was used to manage and implement government policies without requiring approval from a legislative branch. In this case, a lot of the legislative branches were actually out of town, which was what ultimately forced the governors to take the helm. So what were the governors attempting to achieve through the use of executive orders? Really, they wanted to have a swift response to COVID-19. It allowed them to respond quickly to the emerging crisis. And of course, timely decisions were crucial to address public health concerns. It gave them flexibility. Governors used the executive orders to implement temporary measures, policies changes, and adapt to the evolving nature of the crisis. It gave them a sense of somewhat of a unified action to their state. It enabled them to coordinate a unified response, ensure that various government agencies were working cohesively toward a common goal. And of course, the emergency powers, they invoked through the executive orders themselves, granting them additional authority to take necessary actions for the public good. And then, of course, since Washington, D.C. was missing at the moment, it allowed them to allocate resources more efficiently, direct funding, personnel, and other assets to areas that needed them most urgently. And of course, there was a communication through executive orders that outlined specific directives, measures, and really allowed government agencies, businesses, and the public to work cohesively. So what was the COVID-19 impact and response? So the COVID-19, of course, it was a public health crisis. The pandemic posed an unprecedented global health crisis with the widespread transmission of the virus leading to severe illness and fatalities. It overwhelmed the healthcare systems. I know here in California, well, across the U.S., that was a major point of concern. There was an economic disruption due to the lockdowns, travel restrictions, and social distancing measures. This They didn't go into the educational aspect in this particular study. I'm assuming because it was a lot to cover, and given that this was the first of its kind, they didn't want to get too much into the details. So, of course, if they would have included it, it would have included schools, universities, elementaries. I mean, you name it. So they did not go into that for this particular study. It granted them global coordination, and then, of course, there was vaccine rollouts, and it allowed them to adapt to the policies. So, 1 second here. So, for the purposes of this study, overall, it did find that the governors lean more towards centralizing power, and they opted towards preemption of their states and local municipalities. So, what does state preemption really mean? It refers to the local legal concept where a higher level of government, in this case the state, restricts or limits the regulatory powers of lower level governments or localities. So the governor's authority, when they exercise preemption, they issued executive orders that set statewide standards superseding certain local regulations. Of course, as I mentioned, it formed a uniformity of guidelines. They attempted to avoid fragmentation in doing so. And then, of course, there was a lot of challenges and criticisms that we'll get into it a little bit later. So brings me to my question number one. And then, of course, we'll go in it. We'll go through this in stages. So stage one, it's March 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic is in its initial phases. Information is limited. So just pretend that you don't know the outcome yet of the COVID-19. We're still in that initial stage. And given the unseen threat of COVID-19 in these early stages, what actions would you have taken to address the threat and keep the people safe? And then just assume that you're the governor of a state.
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So just pretend that you're the governor of a state. The information in regard to COVID-19, it's still in its early stages, so it's somewhat limited to you. What actions would you have taken to address the threat and keep the people safe of your state?
And just to clarify, it's during the initial part of it, like, I don't know, March 2020, or are we talking?
March?
Okay.
Around March 2020.
Oh man, that's tricky. That's a tricky question. I feel like we still didn't know too much, but I know it seemed like everything closed down in March. So I mean, it's really tricky. My discussion leader assignment goes into the comparison of the COVID-19 response and the Great Recession, but I don't know, man. I think that's a lot of weight to carry in order to keep your citizens safe, and you kind of have to, I think, in a way, defer to the federal government before making any big moves, I think.
Yeah, one of the things I would also say, as governor, right? You cannot have blanket wide policies. Every local jurisdiction should also have a say in how they're handling that issue. But you also want to develop a task force, have a communication. So that's where you talk about the intergovernmental relations, have that communication instead of, oh, okay, this is a one size fits all executive order that's going to go across, even counties that has been like not affected, and then there's counties that has been super affected. So it's like there's got to be some varying differences. So I would say a task force and having some more authority for the local governments to have a say in how they implement, and then also look at the federal government for funding and resources and allocation of what's necessary in case and monitoring. So I think those are going to be key in the early stages. You want to be able to monitor and plan for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You both bring up a really good point. I know as I was reading this article, I was trying to separate my opinion on it now that we are post-COVID. And I was trying to place myself in the governor's shoes in those initial stages. And you guys are absolutely correct. And that's pretty much what the study found in stage one, which is in these initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot of bipartisan executive orders. And you mentioned, Brian, that there was different municipalities. Some of them were never really hard hit, others were extremely hard hit. So that was something that the governors were struggling with initially. How do you implement executive orders? I understand you're trying to streamline the entire process, but what if lockdowns aren't the best idea for some municipalities, and the hard hit ones are, of course. So yeah, that stage one, the study found that it didn't really matter what political party the governor was from. It appeared that both of them were looking to get protective equipment for health workers, ventilators, supplies. They were trying to get help from the White House. And really, in this initial stage, the people's health was of primary concern. And then some of the items that they used for the purpose of this study was, one second, let me get to the page. So these are some of the lists that they use. So they used, of course, Democratic governors in power, lame ducks, local autonomy, ideological asymmetry, unemployment, cases, constants. They didn't use political polarization, which I thought would have been a good one. And they didn't use another item, which I'll discuss here in the end. So some of the findings were across observed levels of local autonomy. They found that the probability of an executive order preempting local government increases from 23.8% to 70.9%. The size of this effect remains persistent across all three phases of the pandemic, with a 1-unit increase in local autonomy, leading to a 22.1% increase in the probability of preemption during phase 1, an 18.5% increase in probability of preemption during phase 2, and a 21.8% increase in probability of preemption during phase 3. So what does this mean? So really, local autonomy were those municipalities that had a little more say. For instance, the article mentioned that the municipalities in Texas were, in the beginning, compliant, but in stage 1 would be the initial lockdown. Stage 2, or phase 2, would be the sort of reopening, but kind of having to backtrack because COVID cases were rising. So during this phase 2, they found that municipalities that had more autonomy, so in this instance, some around Texas, were not as conducive to the executive orders that the governor was trying to implement upon them. So that's why they saw a bit of an increase on preemption during phase 2 towards these municipalities. And then stage 3, it's really when the lockdown fatigue comes in both spectrums, both Democratic and Republican municipalities. So really, this is when the governors attempt to lay down the law, even though a lot of municipalities are tired of the COVID lockdowns. Some of the mental effects are weighing in, and some of the more rebellious municipalities are starting to say, hey, enough is enough. So the findings found, it was found that statistically significant difference between Democratic and Republican governors' use of preemption in these models, and a mismatch between ideology of the governors and localities, and these effects are strongest during phase 3 of the pandemic. Democratic governors were more likely to issue preemptive provisions in phase 3. On average, a Democratic governor is 33.9% more likely to issue a preempting order compared to a Republican governor. Ideological mismatch was modestly significant in predicting preemptive measures in phase 1, but was associated with fewer preemptive provisions in phase 3. In responding to the pandemic, the nation's governors took strong and decisive action in the face of little support from the federal government, and in doing so, they often preempted their local governments. They found that the party of the governor was not consistently significant in the tendency towards centralization, nor was the ideological mismatch with local officials. However, they did find some variation across time periods. For example, in phase 3, Democratic governors were more likely to associate with preemption, but ideological asymmetry led to a bit of more empowerment. Interestingly enough, this article mentioned that Republican-controlled legislature in Florida began to look at ways to rein in Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' emergency powers. And keep in mind, DeSantis was almost seen as the governor that was doing the correct thing during the pandemic, if for lack of better words. He was basically the opposite of what the Democratic governors were doing. And at one point, it almost seemed like he was the one that actually had the best solution towards that pandemic. But even then, his own legislature thought that this situation with the pandemic presented a situation where the governor had way too much power, so they were looking for ways to limit those powers in the event of a future crisis. So that was actually kind of interesting. Question number 2, do you believe that other factors should have been discussed that might have been impactful in the study, such as political polarization or personal gain to political stardom, or any other factors that you guys might have think, other than like the Democratic governor, the Republican governor, governor's power, if it was a lame duck governor, local autonomy? Do you guys think that the study missed any important factors?
Maybe did it include anything about public perception or court of public opinion, or long-term likability? Did that take into account?
No, actually, they did not. Those would have been good ones, especially the public perception as far as to how it weighed towards the governor's decision making, and then even the long term one, I feel like would have been a great one, because that definitely influenced the governor's decisions as the pandemic prolonged.
Yeah, I remember what I think it was said that the solution cannot be worse or the answer can be worse or something. But sometimes when you build a plane as you go, you make mistakes. But there was one of the things that I think that you mentioned is the autonomy, that I feel like it was very draconian and totalitarian without having a say. These mandates weren't law per se. So there's a different process, right? I think in the first class they were talking about how mandates are enacted, and then there's kind of pressure from the federal government for the states to enact it. But at the end of the day, there was not really that type of communication. So I think that's another thing that maybe could have been factored in. But yeah, the personal gain, I'm sure there was an opportunity to use that as a platform for future political aspirations.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're correct. It definitely felt draconian at one point. I mean, I was doing my best to place myself in the governor's shoes and remember that, the information was limited initially. And I sort of understood why they opted for executive orders and why they opted for centralizing power, but I don't know, as the pandemic prolonged and they saw the resistance and they sort of ignored the public perception on it, they continued to attempt to just hammer down their will on the people. And then lastly, we'll wrap it up with the public reception and controversies during COVID-19. So really, public responses to COVID-19 were diverse. They varied widely. Some supported the strict measures for public health, especially, the elderly, and in case you had elderly folks living with you, while others opposed restrictions due to concerns about personal freedoms or economic impacts. The mask mandates were a topic of controversy. It sort of became this no mask versus masker thing online. there was definitely lockdown fatigue. The more prolonged, the more people expressed frustration and resistance to the continued restrictions. Economic concerns. I mean, they had to pass the CARES Act, which was the biggest, or if not one of the biggest, implementations of money into the country. Like without it, everything would have crashed. And then, of course, vaccination. There was hesitancy towards the actual vaccinations. I know personally, I was, you could say, forced to get it. I was in the police academy at the moment, and they sort of dangled the carrot in front of us that if we didn't get it, we were not allowed to leave campus. So ultimately, I opted to get it, but my decision would have probably been different had I been out in public. At one point, it almost seemed like the actual response became sort of politically polarized. Like it became a topic of Democrats versus Republicans, and the benefit of the people actually took the backseat to it. And then, of course, there was challenges to the authority, as was the case with Texas, the Texas municipalities, as was the case with Florida, and then even here in California, with the governor facing a challenge to his governorship. And then I don't know, I feel like social media definitely amplified the whole situation. Even the local media or the national media, they had the little death clock on the corner, and it was just counting, and it was almost amplified beyond comprehension, of sort of just as a means to keep the people, I don't know, maybe fear in them or something. And then lastly, the impact on trust institutions, really. This might have the biggest impact in regards to how governors react to future crises, because we had the fall of once prominent figures such as the Cuomo brothers and even Dr. Fauci, who ultimately disappeared. After the pandemic, there was a lot of questions left unanswered, and he kind of went into the background. And this doctor was the one responsible for the response. So, just to wrap it up, question number 3: do you believe the response to the COVID-19 pandemic hurt or help future responses to crisis, and in what way?
Hi, Adolfo. So I think it helped whether or not, I guess if you agreed with the policies, then it sort of sets an example of what to do in the future. And if you disagree with the policies, then you can learn from the mistakes that you think were made.
So Adolfo too, I was also curious, I think you mentioned before earlier about Title 42. So during the pandemic, uh, that was another concern, right? We had all these concerns about restrictions and lockdowns, but what was what was our process in vetting, asylum seekers? What was there a different process for that? I mean, I think you have more first-hand experience. Did you see that if there was a way that it could have been done better or things that were done well? Just curious about that piece.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So with Title 42, actually, it was sort of genius by then President Trump to use that legislation to handle the asylum crisis. Um, Basically, the borders would have been ran over as they are right now with the Biden administration, but because the asylum seekers, they've been coming in since 2020. The media didn't really report on it when it initially started, but now that it's a major crisis across the southern border, um, they're finally reporting on it. But to get back to your question, Brian, President Trump utilized Title 42 as a way of turning people back, basically. So the U.S. is supposed to allow people that come to the ports of entry a chance for asylum. And then this, of course, it the asylum is the asylum seekers, it's extremely backlogged. So right now we're basically allowing everybody into the country to see a judge on the on the uh, on the promise that they'll show up to their court date. So Trump knew that, and then he utilized Title 42 to say, "Hey, we cannot allow you access into the country right now because there is a pandemic." So come around next time when the pandemic is over, and we would just deny people, deny. And that was basically how he managed the asylum crisis, by utilizing a health law to deny asylum seekers.
So he managed the humanitarian crisis by putting it off to other years.
Yeah, actually, basically. So he kind of kicked the can down the road, because nothing really got resolved. Like, people were still in Mexico, people were still bordering the US, but they just did not have access into the US because of the pandemic. So once Title 42 was taken away by the Biden administration, that's the reason why why it was so overwhelming, because all these people that were waiting in the sidelines just came. And not to mention all of the other caravans that were already making their way over.
So essentially, it sounds like from your explanation, Trump said, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to push it on to someone else to deal with it.
I mean, I'm not sure if that was his ultimate goal. I know his goal was not to allow the southern borders to get overwhelmed, and he strategically used Title 42 to prevent that from happening. But then once the Biden administration took it away, it took away the ability for customs basically to deny entry to these people. And so I'm not sure if he didn't realize how many people were waiting on the sidelines, but that's the reason why there's been such a staggering migrant crisis.
Yeah,
And
it sounds like it took away the ability to continuously kick the can down the road for anybody else and finally kind of figure out what to do.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's definitely one of the impacts that came about. I mean, because nobody could ask for asylum, nobody that had a visa could come in, so the border was really tight. And as soon as that regulation was removed, and we saw the consequences of it.
So one of the things with that, like in terms of federalism, you see how the federal government was able to institute something, in terms of protection. Like in terms of state governments, like I'm sure maybe Texas was more amenable to that, but like maybe the state of California, was there any like does the governor have any powers to override like those type of things, or how was the intergovernmental relationship between like those, that aspect from your opinion?
Technically, the governors do not have the power to override what is going on in federal land. Now, we have seen Texas say, I'm not going to listen to you, and I'm going to go ahead and protect my border. They even ignored the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court told them to cut down the barbed wire that they're putting alongside the Texas border. And they ignored it. The barbed wire is still there, and they actually used their National Guard to sort of create a wall between the barbed wire and the immigration personnel. That way they cannot take in more asylum seekers. And it sounds pretty gnarly, right? But it just feels like there should be better leadership coming from the top down. And the Biden administration is basically allowing everybody to come in. I mean, there's an application. It's called CBP1. All you got to do is book yourself an appointment, and within a few weeks, you'll be in the States. So really, Texas is being overwhelmed. All of the southern states are being overwhelmed. Texas, Arizona, California, you name it. But the one that is being reported on the most is Texas, more than likely because here in Tijuana, bordering the city of San Diego, they have the National Guard out there, and they're pushing the people back so that it doesn't appear like there's a crisis. And it's not our National Guard; it's the Mexican National Guard.
Wow, very interesting. Thanks.
No problem. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you very much, Adolfo. And very, very interesting discussion on immigration. And it really is coming to a head now between states like Texas and the national government. This article is interesting because the authors really, as you pointed out, Adolfo, really wanted to take a quantitative approach to kind of studying why we have preemption in some instances and not preemption in other instances. And so they put together this regression analysis. And I was really intrigued in the regression analysis how I think they were surprised too, the authors, at some of the variables that were not statistically significant and other variables that were statistically significant. And the one that they found was statistically significant and had the strongest significance level was that a variable of local autonomy. And so it seemed like governors were more likely to issue these strongly preemptive mandates to local governments that had a lot of autonomy, that were stronger local governments. And I thought that was a really interesting conclusion that they came to. And I don't want to get into the regression analysis too much because there are a couple things I wish the authors would have done a little differently in their regression analysis, such as using beta weights and things like that. But when you look at the bottom of that chart on page 412, and when it has the R squared, if you remember what R squared is, your coefficient of multiple determination, essentially what the R squared does is it tells you that when you take the combination of all of your independent variables and you add them all together, how much does that combination of independent variables explain of the variation in your dependent variable, which would be the preemption variable? And if you notice, those R squared numbers are relatively small, and I don't have it in front of me now. Let me pull it up real quick so I can take a look at it. But I believe it's for the total model, the R square is 0.176, and a 0.176 R squared means that the combination of all the variables that they use explains only 17.6% of the variation in the dependent variable of preemption. And I think that gets to directly to what Adolfo, that question that you asked, I think is a great one, is what additional variables should the authors have used that they did not use? And when you see an R square of 17.6%, what it means is that there's almost 83% of the variation in the dependent variable that is still left unexplained, which means that there are a lot of other variables out there that could be very important to explaining preemption that were not included within this analysis. And so I think that's a great critique of the analysis that was done by the authors. I think there are some other variables. I really like the one that you mentioned in terms of essentially political ambition, and to look at if governors were looking at COVID-19 and their response to COVID-19 as kind of a springboard into a national position. And we've seen Governor DeSantis talk about his response to COVID-19 in his, well, what's now failed, but his presidential campaign for the Republican nomination. And so I think that's an important one, something that would measure some type of political ambition on the part of the governors. And I don't think we should be terribly surprised that in a crisis situation where we have very little information and an imperative to act very quickly, that it tends to be governors who then step into that void and are the ones who act quickly. You think about, you have a governor who is a singular individual. That singular individual can certainly react much quicker than a state legislature of 150 or 200 members. Oftentimes a state legislature that may not even be in session. And when you think about, here in California, we have a very professionalized state legislature. And so they're in session a lot more than some other states. In some other states, they're in session once every 2 years or maybe once per year for a week. And so they just don't have the capacity to respond with that type of urgency that a singular actor like a governor can respond. So very well done. Thank you, Adolfo. Very interesting article. We'll move into our next article now, which is the fiscal federalism and economic crises, and that one belongs to John.
Good evening, everybody. So this particular article basically compares the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic and the Great Recession. It's written by Marielle Lopez Santa Anna and Philip Rocco. So this article reviewed the pandemic's fiscal effects on subnational governments and the federal government's response. They compared the response to COVID-19 during the Trump administration with the Obama administration's response to the Great Recession. The author blamed high rates of infection and death to the Trump administration's transactional and punitive approach to providing aid. This resulted in what is commonly referred to as fend for yourself federalism. This is a model of intergovernmental fiscal relations in which federal officials make a conscious choice to let states sink or swim. In March of 2020, Democrats and Republicans passed the CARES Act to help, the CARES Act to help states, as mentioned in other presentations. But there were restrictions on how the funds could be used. I mean, like with any other, bit of money coming to the public. Additionally, Congress did not sustain the level of funding in the second half of the year, which the authors believe push governors to lessen restrictions to stimulate their economies and thus causing the virus to spread further. Depending on the state's kind of, makeup of tax revenue, I think Brian touched on it in another presentation. Some states suffered worse than others because they obviously relied heavily on tax income from travel, food, and as you can imagine, the oil businesses, people aren't driving anywhere anymore. The article broke down the federal legislation, or basically the funds that were provided to fix the Great Recession and the COVID pandemic. Basically, there was funds on both ends kind of allocated to the same stuff. So for example, there was Medicaid, matching rate increases. There was education and other funds provided, or I should say education funds and that were provided, and then urban infrastructure funds were provided, housing funds were provided, municipal loans were also provided. I think the only difference that I could see was there was flexible aid provided, specifically 150 billion for COVID-19, none for the Great Recession, and then there was some continuous Medicaid coverage provided as well during COVID-19, and none for the Great Recession. As Adolfo mentioned earlier, it was, much larger. The COVID-19 or CARES Act funds provided were much more substantive than the aid provided during the Great Recession. One unique difference that was pointed out in the article, which is pretty obvious, is obviously the housing, the Great Recession was also kind of a big part of obviously, probably the main part of it was the housing crisis as well, where prices plummeted and, people had these crazy loans, if you guys can remember. But basically, as prices in homes decrease, tax revenue for these homes decrease as well. So some states rely on that more than others. And then obviously that wasn't really a factor during COVID. Houses pretty much stayed steady. I think everyone kind of foresaw the housing market to crash, but it sure hasn't, that's for sure. The authors pretty much throughout the article just harp on Republican governor run states relaxing restrictions early, obviously to maintain economic stability, which they really push, cost more lives. But, the article doesn't provide any data to substantiate it or correlate it at all, which I thought was kind of interesting because it's kind of the whole premise of the article, but they don't show anything about it, which is interesting. And then as you guys touched on in the last presentation by Adolfo, I really do remember a big comparison between California and Florida, Ron DeSantis and Governor Newsom. I vaguely remember, there was a lot of talks on the news about Florida being opened and thriving while California was still heavily masked and closed up. The remnants of this are still seen today. I mean, one big example is, despite, being post-pandemic, we're still on Zoom today, which is, obviously a remnant of that. And then as Adolfo mentioned with vaccines, a lot of people, were forced to get vaccines or maybe get vaccines they wouldn't otherwise have. I know I kind of laughed when I entered this program because that was one of the things I kept getting emails about. You need to submit your proof of vaccination. I'm like, I'm online. What's going on? So, that kind of pushed you to get a vaccine and submit your card and get your third dose and submit your card, and kind of interesting. So for those of you, the first question, for those of you who remember the Great Recession, and this is on a personal level, were you financially impacted by it? And if you could please share that.
So I think I was maybe 14 at the time, and how that affected me is I remember maybe there wasn't that many people like eating out or like at the mall, so like shopping, all that leisure activities kind of slowed down. That's what I can recall.
I can share because I was just graduating from high school, and I had just also actually graduated from trade school. I was an automotive tech for Toyota, and during that time, I believe I was in my 20s. I remember my early 20s, 1920. So I was already an established technician at Toyota for a couple years. And during that time, like Brian said, a lot of people were not spending their dollars. We suffered a lot as a business, and we lost a lot of revenue. And the tech side of the service for Toyota, we lost a lot of money, a lot of customers. So what happened to me and the way that I got affected was I was one of the newer techs. So they ended up cutting a bunch of positions. And the only reason why I stayed on towards the end was because I was certified, because I had just graduated from trade school. So that kind of um, helped me stay on board. But in the end, they ended up cutting a bunch of techs and had to change the service department because there isn't that much traffic coming in for the service department.
Yeah, so those are some good examples. I think I was in the same boat. I had just graduated high school 2007 and was going to Cal State Fullerton, living at home, and got a part-time job at Target, so like I didn't really feel the impacts of it. Thankfully my parents were in a good situation financially, so I don't remember that being much of an issue at all for me at the time. But so the next question is, you know, the same question, but COVID, right? So during COVID, was your personal budget, your finances impacted as a result of the economic strains from the pandemic?
I
Hi,
think
John. Oh,
oh,
sorry.
go ahead. Oh, you go ahead.
Thanks. I was just gonna say that because I don't think I mean, I couldn't go anywhere really. I think I saved money during the pandemic. If we had to go out, it was only for the groceries, the necessities. So, if you went to a restaurant, you couldn't really sit down. You had to get takeout. And at least personally, if I go to a restaurant, I'm more likely to order more than if I just do takeout. But because, we work for a public agency, our job, or at least we were able to work from home. So my salary and my income stayed the same. I was just spending less.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was gonna echo what Ifa said. Yeah, a lot of that you were saving money, and yeah, thank God I was blessed enough to have a work for the county at the time, so my job wasn't affected. But I know a lot of people, like a lot of my friends, they had businesses, they were highly impacted. They couldn't. That
I think we lost you, Brian. You there? Well, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, I agree with Ifat said. I mean, we were definitely saving more than spending. However, I work for two local cities, and for one of them, We were furloughed. We weren't fired or taken off the books, but obviously we weren't working, no money coming in. So it did harm me in that matter. Also regarding the other city, they were debating making the vaccination requirement, and this is when it was first starting. So there was a lot of us hesitant on taking those first round of doses. So we were potentially going to lose our jobs, but everything worked out. But losing out on the one of the cities being furloughed did harm me.
Thank you. And then Brian, just want to check in if you got your mic going. All right, we'll move on. So
John,
that
can I-
leads me. Go ahead. What was that? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I read the same article for the critique, and it was really interesting. And one thing that I realized was that there's a difference, obviously, when we're looking at like, local and county and state governments and how they're affected. And I wasn't affected, but I do have a close friend who works for the state, and he was not laid off or anything, but he was given the option to either cut back in hours, so go into like a, kind of like a higher part-time hourly weekly stage, to cut down on expenses on salary costs, or to actually keep the 40 hours but take a pay cut for however long they decided it was needed in order to kind of stay afloat with their budget. So we definitely saw like different levels of government being affected differently based off of, where like their budgeting was coming from.
Thank you. And yeah, that leads me to my next question. So we covered the personal aspect, their personal impact of both of these incidents, but what about at work, right? So basically, was your job or was your budget impacted? And I think and we'll start with the Great Recession. So with the Great Recession, I'll give an example. I think at the time, I remember right before the Great Recession, you saw a lot of law enforcement, recruitment billboards, and then right after that, it was completely shut down. No one was hiring freezes. And so if there's anything in your job or budget that you can remember regarding the Great Recession. Anybody? And then
I know for me personally, I think I just got my worker's permit. And I know that I had a tough time finding a job, so I didn't end up finding anything during that time. A lot of places weren't hiring, they were closing out positions, reducing hours, etc.
Perfect.
Hey,
And
John.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Well, at the time I was 16 myself, but I do recall Customs went on a hiring freeze for a number of years after the Great Recession, and then my dad, who was the sole provider at the moment, lost his job as a foreman, and then the construction industry took a major hit. Like it never really got back to what it once was. So I know that the term Great Recession makes it sound like it wasn't a depression, but I think its impacts were felt across the country by a lot of people, almost to a degree where they were more personally impacted than the actual COVID-19 pandemic.
Awesome. And I think looking back, I think what I do sort of remember now, towards the tail end of the Great Recession, I was working for Wells Fargo, which, if you guys remember, Wells Fargo and several other banks got bailout money from the government because the banks were hurting. And shortly after I left Wells Fargo, but during that time, I mean, there was a heavy push for opening new accounts, and that led to the later, scandal that came a few years later. But kind of interesting, kind of to work there and see it firsthand. But go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, sorry, John. I was gonna say I remember that time period, and it was interesting because at the time, a lot of jobs that were historically very secure were being hit hard at the time. I remember there were a lot of city jobs that unfortunately had to be let go because of, for whatever reason, with budgets and whatnot happening during the Great Recession. And it was jobs like in nonprofits that were historically not the most appealing, but that tended to have more job security because of the need for their services at the time, because people were struggling. So it was kind of this flip flop of what you wouldn't typically see during the Great Recession. And so I just felt it was just an interesting time to be employed or unemployed because we were all kind of struggling.
Thank you. Yeah. So we'll go to the same question, but for COVID. So obviously during COVID, was your job or your budget impacted?
So for me, working for the county, we received the ARPA funds, which is the American Rescue Plan Act. So there was a lot of money. So there was a lot of job opportunities too. So that was one of the bonuses from the pandemic, to have like more surplus to hire people during to assist during the pandemic.
That's a good point. I actually forgot all about ARPA till right now. Thanks for bringing that up. So I'll share my perspective. I was a school resource officer. School, was open at the time, and then next thing you know, March, whatever the date was, hey, school's going to be closed indefinitely, and hey, John, you're going back. You're going to work patrol. So I go back to patrol, and we set up platoon schedules, which is pretty different. Right now, our schedule system's very kind of fluid. There's kind of like the senior schedules and the new guy schedules, the guys that are working Friday, Saturday, Sunday and whatnot. But so we all switched to basically 2 shifts. So everyone either worked Sunday through every other Wednesday, or vice versa, every other Wednesday to Saturday. And there was, obviously a day shift, a night shift for both. And so by making us work every other Wednesday, we got, baked in overtime into our time sheets, and plus all the monies that were flowing in from the stimulus checks. I mean, I think I made more money that year. So I definitely, calls for service were down. People were in their houses, and it was a totally different time. And then obviously what came later was the riots and all the other fun stuff. But yeah, my job, being an essential worker, definitely was not impacted too much. And anyone else? What about Michael? I think dealing with kind of the mental health field and the medical field at the same time. What about you? Anything that you can relay?
Yeah, for us, we got put on a hiring freeze also, and then we we actually had our schedules changed, so we had to take off. We weren't allowed to take time off, but we had to take a pay cut, and then in return we would get furlough hours. So we'd basically get more vacation time that we can use later down the line. But there was some telework options as well, but we're patient focused and we have to be there. We weren't able to take that much time off, so we still have to be there. But I mean, overall, yeah, we just had to take a pay cut.
Man, that's not fun. That is not fun. Melissa, your hand's still up. I just want to make sure. Okay, never mind.
I am so sorry, John. I left it up, but I during that time, nonprofit again, speaking into that side of things, there were more opportunities again through COVID. Even though the services had to shift, there was a big need for nonprofits to shift services and provide additional services they wouldn't typically do because of COVID, because people were struggling. So one of my former employers actually shifted from being an after school program to being a food distribution center during COVID. So once again, there was additional security at the time for some of the jobs that you wouldn't typically would be secure.
Nice. Thank you for that. So that kind of leads to the last question, which and again, it's kind of a blur. I don't know if I even want to remember too much of it anymore, but you know, based on the article stating that, you know, the funds kind of forced, or the lack of funds kind of forced states to reopen. Does anyone have any feedback on that? I know Adolfo kind of touched on it. I think the word you're looking for earlier was like DeSantis was like the poster child of maybe a successful regime during COVID. Anybody have any other thoughts on that?
I think it was interesting during that time because travel was very difficult. But on the other side, if you were able to do it, it was very cheap because there was a lot of incentives. So for me, I actually got eloped during that time. You know, thank God we actually had a really great deal. We were able to travel during like the in the middle of the pandemic, like right after in 2021 to Bora Bora. And it's like typically if it wasn't pandemic times, that would have been like in the 20,000s. So we got like a really good deal. So I would say some of the things were like, I don't know if you were seeing memes, but I know there was like flights that were like $30 and 40, like everything was really cheap. Those are some of the benefits. Like after all the lockdowns and closure, they were just trying to encourage people to travel and just enjoy the services like during those peak times when we have like lower case counts. So I just wanted to share that those are one of the benefits of you know, of not having too much economic business, to have like promotions and to start to kickstart that up again.
Yeah, that's a good point. You lucked out because I think everyone else that got married after COVID, man, they were on wait lists. They were they were spending a lot more money than they would have. So a lot of places capitalized on that. That's a good point. And I think a lot of people, if I remember, there was like some kind of promotion for like cruise ships where you could pay in advance for, you know, tickets to a cruise ship that would probably be more expensive. And I think people were heavily investing in that, in those industries, the travel industries, because they knew that eventually things would open up and they'd be able to take advantage of that. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say also never before has airlines ever been so flexible in cancellation and refund. So that was one of the other benefits because I was able to get, you know, if you couldn't fly for whatever reason or you get a COVID test, or they were so much easier, you know, during that time than they are like now. I think they're trying to pull back now. So they give credit instead of full refund. So I think that was kind of interesting. A lot of presidents were set in.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Maybe there was some good that came out of all this. Anyone have any closing thoughts or anything else they want to bring up to the team that they feel is relevant to this discussion? Perfect. Well, I thank you all for sharing, and we'll get on to the next one.
Hey, John, thank you very much. Well done. And what you ended on, that's an interesting point is, you know, what types of artifacts are left over from the response to COVID? You know, what changes do we make during COVID that we still have with us today that we might not otherwise have if it wasn't for the response to COVID? And one thing I can certainly think of from my experience on the school board is the idea of free lunches to students, you know, regardless of ability and regardless of income. And so every student is then allowed to have a free lunch. And then, well, that was something that came out of COVID. I remember in my district, even when we were remote, we would have remote sites set up where we would hand out lunches to students as they would come by in their cars. And now today, here in California, that's become a law and that's become the approach. And so everyone has access to those free lunches. And so that's an example of a policy change that has now become permanent, even if we want to call it post-COVID, even in the post-COVID era. And I think the approach of the article, as John talked about, is a really interesting one in that it says, well, let's look at the impact of COVID, but let's look at it within the perspective of the Great Recession and see, you know, what happened in terms of the response to the Great Depression and what happened in the response to COVID. And you know, one of the things that we saw in COVID is we saw much more federal money, more programs and more money flowing out from Washington, D.C., to state and local governments than what we saw in the response to the Great Recession. I think that one of the problems with that is that that money ends eventually. And so what it ends up doing is it's basically a Band-Aid whereby for a year or so after COVID, after the height of COVID, state governments had received all this additional federal money. And so the fiscal impacts of COVID did not look as great. Now, since a lot of those federal grants are starting to go away, now we're starting to see the true impact of COVID on state finances. And that's why everyone thought that in the wake of COVID, the state of California would end up with a huge deficit. And in fact, it had a surplus. It was doing really well because of all this federal money that was coming in. Now that a lot of those grants are being phased out, now we're starting to see the true impact of COVID on things like the Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley businesses. And as a result, that's why we're dealing with anywhere from a $39 to $68 billion deficit, depending upon if you talk to the governor or if you talk to the legislative analyst office. And I think that's a common thing that we have seen happen. That's very similar to what happened with Proposition 13 here in California in 1978. Proposition 13, which was passed by the voters in 1978, greatly reduced the ability of local school districts to generate money from the property tax. And so people thought immediately there would be a big drop in the amount of revenue that local school districts had access to. Well, the fact was that the state of California backfilled a lot of that lost revenue for the first 2 years after the passage of Proposition 13. So you didn't see the big drop off in revenue until 1981. And then that's when you saw the big drop off in revenue for local school districts. Another interesting thing in the article is near the end of the article where the authors talk about this idea of a moral hazard. And this idea of a moral hazard is that it's kind of a moral dilemma whereby because of our system of fiscal federalism and the fragmentation that comes with our system of fiscal federalism, in a crisis like COVID, it allows the national government to push off very difficult moral decisions onto state and local governments. And so now state and local governments are grappling with the decision of, do we protect public health? Or do we pursue additional revenue? And whereas that's oftentimes a decision made at the macro level, at the national level, because of our system of fiscal federalism, it's a decision that was pushed off to subnational governments. And it just kind of, again, highlights this idea that because of our system of federalism, we have a lot of fragmentation in our system. That fragmentation is always there. However, in crisis situations, that's when that fragmentation really does get highlighted. And we saw the highlighting of fragmentation in the response to the COVID pandemic. So it is interesting to say, what's the impact of COVID compared to what was the impact of the Great Recession on the finances of subnational governments? So this idea of fragmentation in federalism is certainly a theme that has run through our entire course. The question is, what is going to happen in the future with this fragmentation? Will we continue to see the fragmentation? Will the fragmentation start to be minimized? The truth of the matter is fragmentation has always been a part of our federal system. So in those State of American Federalism articles for the past 2 years, the authors of both of those articles talked about that fragmentation and how that fragmentation is going to lead to battles between national and state governments over issues such as voting rights, issues such as immigration, as we've talked about a few times tonight. And the reason why you have these battles that we'll see in the future of federalism between national and state governments is due primarily to party polarization. And in the articles, they talk about the fact that Republicans have been very successful at winning seats in state legislatures. Republicans were successful at winning seats in the House of Representatives, even though it's a very close party division. They have the majority in the House of Representatives. However, most of your large metropolitan areas are being governed by Democratic elected leaders. So what you end up with is you end up with in the House of Representatives and in the state legislatures, you have a much more conservative policy orientation than what you have in your major metropolitan areas. And so that's where we see these wars over things such as sanctuary cities. And the national government and during the Trump administration and state governments are now saying we're going to start withholding money, intergovernmental grants, from those sanctuary cities because they're just too darn liberal. And so I think a lot of this party polarization is going to be highlighted and magnified by the fragmentation that we have in our federal system. So that then begs the question from a federalism perspective of why we have this party polarization. And this is something that we have talked about earlier in our semester together. And a lot of it, I think, boils down to the idea of gerrymandering. And a couple times tonight, we have talked about the influence of partisan gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering occurs when a political party that is in power will redesign and restructure the districts in order to gain as many seats as possible, either in the House of Representatives or in a state legislative body. When you do that partisan gerrymandering, oftentimes you can engage in two different processes. There's what's called cracking and packing. In the cracking approach, if you have, say, for instance, a Democratic majority in the state legislature, when they will then do their redistricting for districts in the state assembly and the state senate, those Republicans, if they see a area, a jurisdiction whereby you have a lot of Democrats, they will crack up that Democratic stronghold in that they'll put small slivers of that Democratic stronghold in a multitude of different state assembly districts. What you do there is you are then diluting the power of those Democratic voters. And it makes it difficult for those Democratic voters to elect a Democratic representative. That's what's known as the cracking approach. The next approach is what's called packing. And in a packing approach, let's say, to be fair, you have a Democratic majority in the state legislature, and that Democratic majority sees a stronghold of Republican voters. What they will do is they'll try and pack all those Republican voters into one district and then kind of give up on that district and say, okay, that district is going to elect a Republican representative. We're going to say that's fine. We'll give up that district so that we can win all the other districts. And that's a packing approach to partisan gerrymandering. The problem with partisan gerrymandering is it creates these safe districts. Safe districts are districts in which the incumbent doesn't have to worry about the general election. The incumbent only has to worry about the primary, because I think, as we've talked about before, primary voters tend to be much more ideologically extreme than general election voters. And so if you're a Democrat and you're in a democratically safe district, any challengers you get are probably going to come from the left. They're going to come from the more liberal side of the Democratic Party. If you're a Republican and you're in a safe district, any challenges you get will come from the right, will come from the more conservative side of the Republican Party. And that's going to be a challenge that you're going to have in the primary. So in order to try and fend off those primary challenges, Democrats will become more liberal, Republicans will become more conservative, and that results in, again, this party polarization, in that both parties are being pulled to the ideological extremes. When you have incumbents who are then being pulled to those ideological extremes, that's going to have an impact upon the types of policies and the types of laws that they support and that they vote for. And so that's why you end up having a more difficult time finding the middle ground between the two political parties. Add into that equation the fact that the judiciary, the federal judiciary, has now become much more conservative than it was in the past because of the multitude of conservative appointments that were made in the Trump administration, and that the Supreme Court has become much more conservative as well as a result of those 3 appointments made in the Trump administration. And you just kind of add to this tension between the two political parties. That party polarization is really going to be the, I guess you would say, the order of the day in the future for our system of intergovernmental relations. And the more party polarization we have, the more of those pitched battles we're going to have over these issues such as voting rights and immigration. And I think those two issues, voting rights and immigration, are going to be the two big issues that we are going to be battling over in federalism for the next several years. The question then becomes, well, then what do we do about this party polarization? To attack party polarization, if we want to do that, the way to do that is through eliminating this gerrymandering process. That becomes very problematic, as we know from the discussion Asael had in terms of the courts and the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court has not really been very inclined to do a lot of things to protect the integrity of the Voting Rights Act. And indeed, with the Shelby versus Holder case and some cases that are coming before the court, it's a very good chance that the Voting Rights Act will continue to be weakened a bit. And so I think you're going to continue to see it more difficult for people to challenge partisan gerrymandering and the redistricting maps that emerge from partisan gerrymandering than it has been in the past. When you're saying only the Department of Justice will be the only one that can bring a case under the Voting Rights Act to challenge a partisan gerrymandering redistricting map, then you're really limiting the ability of bringing those cases. And you've got essentially one person who will decide whether or not that case should be brought. So I think that you've got this confluence of all these factors, and the basic theme that ties the State of American Federalism articles together is the increasing influence of politics. And I think that increasing influence of politics is going to be one of the major trends that we're going to see as we do move forward. So that's kind of my pitch in terms of where we're going now in the future of American federalism. I think that what we have done throughout this term is we have really worked our way through all the different influences on federalism, from the constitutional basis of what the US Constitution says about federalism, through how federalism becomes very political and how state and local governments work together or sometimes against each other to combat federal influence. We've talked about fiscal federalism and how the relationship between the different levels of government really gets defined by intergovernmental grants and how those grants have changed over the years, depending upon the goals and objectives of the national government. And then we've also talked about the administrative aspects of federalism and how a lot of the decisions about which level of government has authority over a policy or over an issue, a lot of that is done on the administrative side of the equation. We get very vague laws passed through Congress because that's the only way you can get anything passed through Congress. And so the actual fleshing out of what that policy means and the roles of the different levels of government, that is then left to the administrators, and especially in terms of bargaining negotiations. And we really highlight just how important bargaining has become in our understanding of American federalism. The basic theme is that our study of federalism has become more difficult. It's become more complex to study federalism today than it was even back when I was in graduate school studying federalism. And the reason for that is, number one, the focus on bargaining negotiations. That makes it much more difficult to study federalism, and the lack of resources and interest in studying federalism issues. The loss of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations means we have lost the centralized source of a lot of research we used to do in federalism. And now that responsibility falls upon us, people who are interested in federalism. It is up to us to do that type of research in a much more decentralized, much more fragmented way. So I don't want to leave you on a very pessimistic note, but it has become more difficult to study federalism, and fewer people today care about federalism and intergovernmental relations than in the past. But I hope what this course has done is it's equipped you well to, when you think about policies and think about issues, you'll think about them not just from the policy perspective, but also from the perspective of intergovernmental relations. That is essentially the course. We're not going to do the Entrepreneurial Cities article tonight, so we're going to just stop there with our articles for the course. Hopefully you've turned in all of your article critiques. I will get to grading those article critiques over the next couple of days. Again, if you would like to replace one of your discussion board grades, feel free to do discussion board number 6, and then I'll just do that grade replacement for you. And I hope to have everything done and graded and final grades ready to go by the end of the weekend. We do not need to have a Saturday class since we've covered all the discussions that we will cover this semester. So you'll get to have Saturday off. However, I do want to mention one thing to you, and that is I've been keeping an eye on the 697 cases. Don't forget about your 697 cases. Several people have finished all 5 of the cases and have turned in their student learning portfolios. And so for everyone who's been able to do that, thank you very much. If you have not completed your 5 cases yet, you have until April 15th to submit your cases. So all 5 cases need to be submitted by April 15th so you can graduate in spring semester. And then your student learning portfolio would need to be shared with me through OneDrive no later than May 1st. So hopefully you've started your cases at least by now, but be working on those cases and get those cases wrapped up no later than April 15th. Your final course in the program is your PPA 540 course, Grants Administration. That is with Dr. Matthews. That course begins on February the 10th, and so that will be your final course in the program. Once you are done with that course, once you've got all your cases finished and graded, once you've turned in and had your student learning portfolio approved, then you are done with all your MPA requirements, and it's just a matter of just hanging tight and waiting until the graduation ceremony in May. Any questions at all about anything programmatic, the 697 cases, this course conclusion, anything at all?
Hi, Professor. Quick question about this course. So there was a couple articles that weren't covered today. Can we still submit that for article critique?
Yes, you can. Yeah, since there are 2 articles, the medical marijuana and the entrepreneurial cities article, since we didn't cover those in class, yes, you can still turn in critiques on those 2 articles.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Sure. Any other questions or anything while you have me here?
Oh, sorry. That's due. We can turn that in Saturday?
Yeah, as long as you turn it in by Saturday, it'll work.
Perfect.
Sure.
Professor, I work nights, Friday night and Saturday morning, and then I go back to work Saturday night. I don't think I'll be able to make the 11 o'clock Saturday class. I just want to give you a heads up.
Well, we won't need to have that class. I mean, we're kind of done with what we need to do, so you can have that Saturday off. So no worries.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, no class on Saturday. We're good, and we're good with this being our last class session for this course.
Oh, Professor, another question since you brought up the 5 case studies. So just so I'm refreshed, so Dr. Butts has like 2 of the cases and you have the other cases. The one that you're assigned, I can ask you about, and the one that he's assigned, I need to ask him about. Is that kind of how it's delegated?
Exactly. Yeah. I will be grading the 555, 577, and most of the 660s. He will be grading 670 and 696. So any questions about those first 3, you can contact me. Questions about 670 or 696, you can contact Dr. Butts.
Professor, it may have just been lost in memory, but the student learning portfolio, what is that?
Sure. Yeah, the student learning portfolio, once you've completed your 5 cases and your 5 cases have been submitted and they have been graded, then you will submit the student learning portfolio. The student learning portfolio is essentially just 3 parts. The first part of the student learning portfolio is that initial skills self-assessment that you did in your PPA 500 course. And then once you've completed your 5 cases in 697, you will essentially redo that with what we call the final skills self-assessment. It is essentially just a redo of the initial skills self-assessment. So in part 1, you just put your initial skills self-assessment and then this final skills self-assessment that you've done after you've completed your 5 cases. That is part 1 of the portfolio. Then part 2 of the portfolio are your pre and your post instructional assignments. You have pre and post instructional assignments, or you should have had them in all your core courses except for 500 and 697. So in 555 budgeting, in 577 HR, in 660 org theory, in 670 policy analysis, in 696 research methods, in the syllabus, there should have been identified a pre and a post-instructional assignment. Those assignments you then put into part 2 of the student learning portfolio. Now, if you're having trouble locating one of those assignments, or you're not sure what those assignments are, if you're not sure what the assignments are, you can reach out to the instructor you had for the course. If you just simply can't find them, you don't have them anymore, just send me an email and let me know. And we'll still be able to approve your portfolio even if you don't have all those assignments in there. But part 2 are those pre and post instructional assignments from those core courses. And then part 3 of the portfolio are those 5 case studies that you're doing in 697. And that's it. That's the student learning portfolio, just those 3 parts. You will submit the student learning portfolio electronically. Go into your single sign-on page and you'll see you'll have all these icons on your page. One of those icons should be OneDrive. Every student and every faculty member has a OneDrive account. So you can click on that OneDrive account, upload your portfolio there, and then share it with me at my email address, david.powell@csulb.edu. Once I get your portfolio, the link for your portfolio, I'll review it. I'm not grading anything again in the portfolio. I'm just making sure that it's organized. You've got those 3 different parts in it, and then I'll approve the portfolio. I'll let Geraldine know once I approve the portfolio, and then she communicates that to Enrollment Services. And once Enrollment Services gets that notice from Geraldine, then you'll notice on your unofficial transcript, at the bottom of your unofficial transcript, you'll see the words graduate project completed. Whenever you see graduate project completed, that means that your portfolio has been approved, Enrollment Services has signed off on it, and then you are good to go for graduation. Does that help?
Wow. Okay. Yes, that helps. Is this information somewhere written that I can refer to?
Actually, I put together a video back when I was chair, walking you through all the steps of the portfolio. So let me get that video from Dr. Butts, and I will post that video to our 535 Canvas class, and so you can get access to it there.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure.
And thank you. This was a really great class. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's my favorite class, so.
Professor, I
Any
have a
other?
question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So just so I'm like 100% clear, so the portfolio will have the case studies that we're currently working on from the directed research part 1 and part 2. That's one of the sections. The other sections is part of the initial skills assessment for each of the courses. And those are assignments that we should have done already, or those are things that we have to do additionally for the portfolio itself?
But no, nothing you're doing additionally. This is all stuff you've already done throughout your coursework. So the initial skill self-assessment is what you did in 500. The final skill self-assessment you will do once you finish your case studies in 697. That's what goes into part 1.
Part 2 is the one I was wondering about. Sorry,
Okay.
I think I got confused.
Yeah, part 2, we call those the pre and post instructional assignments. And so, yeah, when you did those core courses, the budgeting, HR, org theory, policy, and research methods, when you did those 5 courses, you should have done a pre and post instructional assignment in each one of those courses. Those pre and post instructional assignments then go into part 2. So the only thing
we already did that.
You already did it. Yeah, those are already done. You did it as part of completing those courses. The only new thing that you're creating is after your 5 case studies will be that final skill self-assessment. That's the only new thing being created. Everything else, the initial skill self-assessment, the pre and post instructional assignments, you've already completed those.
Got it. Okay, cool. And then last question is, I know you mentioned that some of the papers that you're grading and some of the other ones that Professor Butts is, does it matter if we just put like Powell on like the professor or instructor name on the cover sheet of the paper, or does it have to be exactly who it is? Because if so, then I think I might have to take notes again.
No. Don't worry about that, because when you submit it, you'll just submit it to the Dropbox in the 697 site that you had, the section 1 from last summer. And when you put it in the Dropbox, we know which Dropbox we're grading, so you don't have to worry about putting names on it like that.
Okay, cool. So it won't matter if I put the wrong professor by accident.
Nope, not at all.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Very good questions, but I'm glad you mentioned. I will put that video. I'll find that video and I'll put it up on our 535 campus site. Brian, do you have a question?
Oh no, so you said there was a video. You said you'll post a video on this forum or on the, sorry, I wasn't clear on that.
Yeah, I'll put it on our Canvas site for 535.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor. Appreciate everything and appreciate this course.
Sure, my pleasure. It's been a pleasure working with everyone. I do hope you got some good information out of the course, and again, that you'll think more about intergovernmental politics and intergovernmental relations as you move forward in your job. So it's been wonderful working with everyone. Like I said, I'll try and get all the final grades wrapped up by the end of the weekend. Then you'll be able to take a little bit of breather, and then you'll be back at it on February 10th for grant administration with Dr. Matthews. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Turn my camera on real quick. Hopefully I won't get kicked offline. Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure working with you. And again, if you have any other specific questions, always feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. Always happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr.
Take care.
Powell.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.